May 1st, 1823. St. Louis stood at the meeting of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers when Thomas Tate Tobin entered the world in a cramped house close to the noisy levee. His father, Bartholomew Tobin, was an Irish immigrant who hired out wherever he could, laying stone one month and hauling cargo the next. His mother, Sarah, carried both European and native ancestry and a past already tied to the fur trade. Widowed from trader Francis Autobes, she brought into the marriage an older son, Charles, who had been born into the world of traps, pack trains, and distant posts that Thomas knew only through talk. The city around the Tobin family swelled with each season. Steamboats crowded the wharves, stacks of cargo rose and fell in an endless cycle, and mixed voices in French, Spanish, English, and Irish cut through blasts of steam and the clatter of wheels. Mud, coal smoke, and animal waste thickened the air. Along the riverfront, dock workers fought over wages, gamblers hunted men who had just been paid, and drunks staggered out of doorways. Disease followed close behind the crowds. Coffin wagons moved toward burial grounds often enough that children like Thomas learned the slow pattern of church bells by repetition rather than ceremony. Inside that small dwelling, Bartholomew held to a simple code. Softness, in his view, killed working families faster than hunger. When work began before daylight, he rose without complaint, swallowed whatever Sarah set before him, and walked out into weather that froze fingers in winter or soaked clothing in summer. At night he returned with shoulders stiff and hands raw, and he drilled into his sons the rules of hard labor, obedience, and restraint. Fighting had its place, he said, but drink, gambling, and idle boasting stripped a man of wages and judgment. In a town already thick with ways to die, he insisted that his boys give danger as little help as possible. Sarah shaped Thomas with different lessons drawn from life beyond St. Louis. Her first husband had vanished into the hazards of the trade, leaving her with Charles and memories of winter camps, dangerous crossings, and tense dealings with distant tribes. She shifted easily between English and Spanish and sprinkled in words learned from native relatives. Around the hearth she spoke plainly of starvation, sudden raids, and thin ice that swallowed men and animals without warning. These accounts carried no ornament. They served as warnings grounded in experience and gave her younger son an early sense that the frontier beyond the river city did not forgive careless people. Charles moved through the Tobin household more like a passing visitor than a settled son. Even in his mid-teens, he carried himself as a man made for open country. His clothing smelled of leather, smoke, and horses, and his attention always leaned toward the western sky. When traders gathered near warehouses and taverns, he slipped into their circles and listened with the focus of someone already halfway gone. He brought home names of far places such as Bent's Fort, Taos, and El Pueblo, along with brief descriptions of high valleys, buffalo herds, and snowbound passes. To young Thomas, sharing a crowded sleeping space and simple meals. His older half-brother embodied a life that stretched far beyond the paved streets and brick walls of Missouri. Daily errands pulled Thomas through every layer of the growing city. Sarah sent him for bread, salt, and lamp oil. He picked his way through wagon ruts filled with dirty water, avoided horses spooked by noise, and kept distance from knots of idle men who watched passers-by too closely. Down on the levee, he saw how working crews moved with constant awareness, never turning their backs fully on any group of strangers. He watched cargo slip and crush a foot, heard curses when someone fell from a plank into the river, and sensed how quickly an argument could shift from shouted insults to fists and blades. No elder needed to spell out the lesson that distraction invited trouble. By the middle of the 1820s, St. Louis had become the main outfitting point for expeditions moving toward the upper Missouri and the far mountains. Warehouses filled with traps, powder, blankets, and trade cloth. Men planning to leave town loaded wagons under the eyes of company clerks who checked every item against ledgers. The names of distant rivers and forts reached Thomas in fragments as parties passed the Tobin house on their way to the wharves or to the open road. He grew up knowing that men left the city for places his father had never seen, and that some of those men never returned. When Thomas reached 5 years of age, 16-year-old Charles stepped fully into that world. There was no long speech or delay. Charles checked his knife and rifle, packed the clothes he owned, embraced his mother, and walked out to join a line of wagons waiting beyond the outermost houses. Thomas and Sarah followed only as far as she allowed. They stood and watched until dust and distance swallowed the column of men, animals, and rolling wheels. The sight fixed itself in the boy's mind, tied to the knowledge that his older brother had chosen a path where family could no longer shield him from anything that lay ahead. Life without Charles settled into a pattern that mixed routine with constant pressure. Bartholomew left early and returned late, muscles aching from hauling stone, beams, and barrels. Sarah kept the household together with careful hands, stretching every coin, patching clothes, and trading labor with neighbors when it helped both sides endure. Thomas swept floors, carried water, and helped scrub laundry in cold weather that numbed his fingers. As the city expanded, empty ground near their home filled with new sheds and houses. Every added building brought more strangers and more chances for a careless step to end in trouble. Bartholomew's answer to the hazards around them was steady effort and strict control. When extra hands were needed, he brought Thomas to job sites on the riverfront or at new construction. There the boy saw walls that shifted in soft soil, scaffolds that moved under weight, and men who left work early with bandaged hands or fresh limps taken from falling beams. Complaints meant little. Crews cursed, wrapped wounds as best they could, and kept at their tasks until they could no longer stand. Thomas absorbed the idea that pain and labor walked together, and that a man who stopped when hurt might quickly find himself replaced and forgotten. Sarah honed a different set of skills. Drawing on experience from life outside the city, she pointed out how the river's smell changed before a storm, how the wind shifted when weather moved in, and how birds grew restless before a hard change in temperature. She noticed tracks in damp ground that marked the passage of animals and wagons and made Thomas see how a single broken twig or displaced stone could carry information. Her lessons treated every patch of ground as something that could be read and every sound as a clue. In a crowded town, those habits might seem excessive. In the open country, they would later keep her son alive. When he could slip away from the tight lanes near the levee, Thomas drifted toward the edges of St. Louis, where fields, brush, and rough pasture still pressed against new streets. He followed small streams, watched fish and frogs, and practiced hitting sticks or stones with a sling or thrown club. On days when he brought down a bird or small animal, he carried it home and watched Sarah dress it for cooking, paying attention to bone, muscle, and organs. Killing for meat had no ceremony in the Tobin household. It ranked alongside hauling water and chopping wood, one more necessary task that reminded the boy how quickly life ended when survival required it. News from the wider West reached the family through letters and spoken messages carried by traders and rivermen. Reports confirmed that Charles trapped beaver in high country, wintered behind log walls, and traveled with well-known figures in the trade. Names such as Bent's Fort, El Pueblo, and Taos came more often, tied to accounts of harsh winters, profitable seasons, and sudden losses to accident or attack. Each message underlined the fact that the older brother now lived in places where help stood many days' travel away, and where judgment under stress often meant the difference between returning and vanishing. For Thomas, these reports shaped his sense of the world more than any church sermon or printed sheet. He pictured river crossings where ice formed on rifle barrels, camps where men took turns standing watch against raiders, and narrow passes where a single rock slide could break a pack train. The stories never promised comfort. They mentioned cracked lips, frost-bitten feet, and companions buried in shallow graves under stone piles. Yet the men who delivered those reports carried themselves with a steadiness he rarely saw on the riverfront. Their eyes measured every doorway and window, and their hands rested near knife hilts or rifle stocks even while they joked. They looked like men who understood that danger never stayed far away. As his early teenage years began, Thomas sought out such men directly. He edged close to their groups near storehouses and taverns, waiting for a pause in talk to ask practical questions. He wanted to know how they found their way when clouds hid stars, how they kept powder dry during long storms, how they stayed awake on lonely watches, and how they read sign in unfamiliar country. Some waved him off, but others recognized a serious questioner and offered short, precise answers. They spoke of marking the lay of land, using prevailing winds and the sun's path, building small fires that gave little smoke, and cleaning rifles no matter how tired a man felt. Their discipline matched the habits Sarah had already planted and gave those habits a hard frame drawn from experience. By the year 1837, Thomas had grown into a lean 14-year-old whose wiry arms and shoulders reflected years of labor. He could carry loads beside his father through long days and still stay on his feet. That year, Charles returned to St. Louis after seasons in New Mexico and on the plains. He brought pelts, trade goods, and a quiet reputation as a reliable trapper and guide. His arrival briefly turned the Tobin house into a gathering place for mountain men who came to exchange news, arrange future trips, and weigh potential partners with the cautious eyes of men who had already buried friends. During those crowded evenings, Thomas sat close enough to hear without drawing rebuke. He listened while Charles described the road from St. Louis across the plains, up the Arkansas River past Bent's Fort, and over the Sangre de Cristo range into the Taos Valley. The details held no polished romance. Charles spoke of horses crippled by hidden holes, blizzards that buried camps, and men who died from simple neglect of tasks, such as securing picket lines or guarding rifles from damp. He also mentioned successful hunts, safe crossings, and the satisfaction of knowing trails well enough to move a small party through hostile territory without losing a single man. Arguments between Bartholomew and Charles carried an edge that made the air inside the house feel tight. The father said that the city, for all its dangers, at least offered steady wages to men who showed up each morning. He pointed to changing fashion and unstable fur prices, reminding his older son that trading companies could fail and that trappers often returned with little to show for years of risk. Charles answered that dependence on distant merchants existed in St. Louis as well. He spoke of bosses who cheated crews, injuries that ended work in an instant, and families turned out of rented rooms when wages stopped. Hardship struck men in both worlds, he argued. In the mountains, skill and caution gave a man more control over his fate than in alleys where a stranger's knife might end him without warning. Thomas weighed every word of these exchanges. He knew the cramped rooms, foul air, and constant noise of St. Louis. He also knew the quiet he found on the outskirts of town, where wind moved through brush and animal tracks marked damp ground. Years of chores had already taught him to keep working when tired, to notice small changes and to hold his tongue rather than brag. Those traits matched the requirements he heard in the trapper's stories, more than the habits of men who drank their wages away in dockside saloons. A sense formed inside him that his nature fit the open country better than the narrow streets, though he also understood that the larger world he considered held risks beyond anything he had yet faced. When Charles began preparing for another journey west that same year, loading wagons with goods and checking harness, the unspoken question within the family finally took clear shape. Thomas stepped to his brother's side and said that he intended to go. Bartholomew studied his son's face and saw resolve rather than impulse. He understood that years of listening had already fixed the boy's path. Tired shoulders sagged for a moment under the weight of that knowledge. Then he gave his consent, adding only that Thomas must carry every lesson learned in St. Louis into whatever country lay ahead, because those memories and habits would be the only part of his father that went with him. Sarah's answer came through action more than words. She gathered what food and clothing the family could spare, pressed a small cross and a few worn keepsakes into her son's hands, and held him in an embrace that carried the memory of a husband lost to distant trails. She knew that no promise could guarantee his return. Her final advice, spoken quietly, urged him to keep his eyes open, his voice careful, and his trust limited among strangers until they had proven themselves with deeds rather than stories. Within days, Thomas walked away from the city that had shaped his childhood. He moved beside Charles and the other men as they steered wagons past the last clustered houses and into open country. Behind him lay crowded streets, brutal dockfights, and the constant tolling of bells for people whose names he had never known. Ahead stretched the road toward Bent's Fort and Taos, into ranges and valleys he had not yet seen but felt ready to face. With each step, the sounds of the levee faded, replaced by the grind of wheels on dirt and the creak of harnessed leather. 14-year-old Thomas Tate Tobin left St. Louis as a hardening youth. The trails he followed from that day forward would shape him into the relentless scout and bounty hunter whose name later disturbed the sleep of men who made their living by killing. 1837 to 1846. The wagon train that carried Thomas Tate Tobin away from the Mississippi Valley pushed out onto prairie that grew wider with each day of travel. Houses thinned and then vanished behind the line of canvas tops and creaking wheels. Ahead lay trace ruts leading toward distant trading posts and mountain passes. Dust rose from hooves and boots until it coated clothing and skin. The air smelled of oxen, sweat, and wood smoke from small cooking fires. For the first time in his life, Thomas slept without city noise in his ears, trading the clatter of St. Louis streets for the distant howl of wind across open ground. Work on the trail fell on every capable hand. Before daylight, men moved among the wagons with lanterns, checking harness and tightening ropes, binding barrels and crates. Thomas hauled water, gathered buffalo chips for fuel where wood grew scarce, and helped heave wheels out of ruts. When the column halted for noon meals, he checked his rifle, brushed dust from the lock, and kept powder tucked where rain could not reach it. Older plainsmen watched to see whether he flinched at long days, sudden orders, and the steady strain of hunger that came whenever game grew scarce. The country itself trained him as much as any mentor. Tall grass swayed in long waves under the wind, hiding holes that could snap a horse's leg. Dry gullies waited beneath crusted surfaces that broke under weight. When clouds built on the horizon, thunder rolled over the prairie and sheet lightning flashed along the distant line where land met sky. Rains turned dust to sticky mud within minutes and forced the wagons to grind forward through clinging ruts. During clear nights, cold settled so sharply that breath hung in the air while men slept wrapped in blankets on hard ground. Along the Santa Fe Trail, danger often gave no warning. Raiders watched distant wagon trains from low rises and river bends, studying numbers, weapons, and discipline. To guard against sudden attack, leaders sent mounted pickets ahead and to each side while the main column rolled. At halts near streams, rifles stayed loaded and close to hand. Charles Audubys and Sarin St. Vrain pointed out signs that Thomas needed to remember, such as fresh horse droppings, cut saplings, or ash from recent campfires along bends in small creeks. Each mark hinted at unseen riders moving through the same country. When the trail joined the Arkansas River, the landscape shifted into stretches of cottonwood groves, sandy banks, and open river bottom. The waterway drew traders, emigrants, and raiding parties alike, The wagons followed its course toward Bent's Fort, a strong adobe trading post that served as a fixed point in a vast region of moving people. As the train drew near, Thomas saw thick walls rising above the river plain, a flag flying from a central tower, and herds of horses and mules grazing under watchful herders. Fires burned within the walls. Smoke and the smell of cooking meat drifted on the wind. Inside Bent's Fort, crowds of Cheyenne, Arapaho, Mexican traders and American company men filled the courtyard. Stacked hides gave off a heavy animal odor. Blacksmiths hammered iron into tools and horseshoes. Trade goods lined storerooms under the supervision of clerks whose books tracked every exchange. Thomas worked under men who expected complete attention. He hauled freight, tended animals, and learned to move respectfully among visitors from nations whose customs he did not yet understand. He listened while interpreters shifted smoothly between languages and watched how the most successful traders spoke little and observed much before offering a single item. His time at the fort did not last through a full cycle of seasons. After supplies had been delivered and arrangements completed, Charles and Siren guided the party south and west toward the passes that led into Mexican territory. The route climbed away from the river and into country where tree-covered ridges framed narrow valleys. Nights grew colder. Thin mountain air carried sounds sharply. Travel slowed as wagons worked up steep grades littered with rocks. At times, men walked beside the teams to ease the strain on animals that had already come many hundreds of miles. Taos lay beyond those passes, a town of adobe structures, narrow lanes, and a plaza that served as market and meeting ground. By the time Thomas entered it for the first time, he had already learned enough Spanish from his mother to catch fragments of conversation from shops and street corners. Now the language surrounded him. He heard it in arguments over prices, in greetings between old friends, and in the curt commands of officials who moved through the plaza. Tribal visitors in blankets and beadwork added further voices and habits to the mix. The frontier that had once been lines on maps to him now took the form of faces, clothing, and weapons gathered in one place. Not far from Taos, at Arroyo Hondo, Simeon Turley operated a mill and distillery that served trappers, settlers, and travelers. The mill ground grain brought in from nearby fields. The stills turned mash into a raw whiskey known for harsh strength and for strange ingredients that gave it extra bite. Customers treated the place as store, saloon, and refuge. Freight wagons pulled into its yard and riders tied off horses under a constant drift of smoke from the chimney. Thomas followed his brother into employment there, stepping into a world that mixed steady labor with sudden disorder. The mill itself required constant attention. Water diverted from the stream powered the wheel. Screens clogged with debris, belts stretched, and wooden gears needed regular checking. Thomas shoveled grain into hoppers, cleared blockages, and waded into cold water to free jams that stopped the wheel. Near the stills, he carried wood for the fires, hauled barrels, and cleaned equipment coated with sticky residue. The sour smell of fermenting mash and the sharp vapor rising from warm whiskey seeped into his clothes. Long days left his arms and back aching, yet the work toughened muscles that had started to form on the trail. More unpredictable labor waited in the yard and common room. Men from distant camps rode in after weeks spent trapping along mountain streams or hunting on the plains. They arrived with packs of hides and stories filled with risk and profit. Once paid in whiskey, they could turn friendly gatherings into fights within moments. Thomas watched knives flash and fists fly when grudges surfaced after 3 or 4 cups. Turley relied on steady hands to drag combatants apart, haul the worst troublemakers outside, and impose a rough order if weapons cleared leather. The young worker learned to step toward danger without hesitation, knowing that indecision left more room for someone to die on the floor. The freight runs that linked Turley's operation to distant posts tested Thomas in different ways. Loaded with whiskey, flour, and trade goods, packed trains and wagons moved north and east toward Bent's Fort, Fort Jackson, Fort Lupton, and El Pueblo. Trails cut through country familiar to raiding parties and hungry predators. Nights on these journeys seldom passed in comfort. Men rotated through guard shifts, sitting their horses on ridges and knolls while the rest of the party slept in blankets near dim coals. Each watcher scanned the dark for movement that did not match the wind, listening for hoofbeats or the soft thud of human feet on soil. When the sun rose, the prudence of those long vigils became clear. On more than one morning, the men found tracks circling the camp where unseen riders had approached closely enough to count horses and men. Sometimes stones had been moved near grazing animals, or faint depressions showed where someone had knelt to study the party. In those cases, the caravan packed quickly and moved on with extra care, grouping the animals tight and keeping rifles where hands could reach them in an instant. Thomas learned to read the worry etched on the faces of older men who had seen what happened when a camp failed to notice these warnings. During winters spent near Taos and Arroyo Hondo, daily work blended with constant exposure to stories of hazard and brutality from the broader region. Trappers returned with accounts of companions frozen along high ridges, crushed in rock slides, or taken by sudden floods. Travelers spoke of wagons burned and families killed on lonely stretches of road. Pueblo and Mexican residents described long memories of broken promises and past violence. Each story added layers to Thomas's understanding of the territory. It had its generous seasons with full larders and easy travel. But it also punished carelessness, and grudges never faded quickly. Every year or so, Turley's business required a trip east with pelts and robes gathered through trade. These journeys took Thomas back along the Santa Fe Trail, toward the river city where his life had begun. He traveled as part of hard crews moving freight rather than as a child trailing family. St. Louis still bustled with dock noise and commerce, yet to his eyes, shaped by time and open country, the city now felt confined. Buildings crowded each other, and the press of people in narrow streets seemed to leave no space for thought. After visiting his mother and seeing how age had begun to bend her shoulders, he returned west with wagons heavy with new supplies for the mill, choosing the risks of the frontier over the crush of the levee. Between trips, his duties widened. The Bent St. Vrain Company trusted him with short scouting assignments along branches of the trail that fed their posts. Turley and the Bent St. Vrain Company relied on him to guide small caravans and to carry messages between Taos, nearby settlements, and their various posts. With each journey, he refined habits already seeded in childhood. He kept mental maps of every stream bed, rock outcrop, and stand of timber. He gauged how long it took to ride between water sources and how quickly a horse tired under various loads. Terrain that had once seemed endless now broke into familiar stretches tied to specific memories of weather, camps, and meetings with strangers. As conflict loomed between the United States and Mexico in the mid-1840s, military traffic along the trails increased. Soldiers in uniform passed through Taos and the surrounding countryside, their movements watched carefully by local residents who measured the changing balance of power. General Stephen Kearny's Army of the West marched through New Mexico during this period, and dispatches needed to move swiftly between his command and more distant points. Tobin's growing reputation as a reliable rider and tracker matched those needs. Orders sent him across long distances with written messages sealed in his possession, traveling light so that he could cover ground quickly while avoiding unnecessary fights. Courier work demanded a cooler mind than many realized. On such rides, Thomas moved with minimal company or alone, knowing that every stranger might weigh him as a target. He chose routes that offered cover without funneling him into blind canyons. When he watered his horse at streams, he kept one hand near his rifle or pistol and his eyes on the surrounding banks. At night he built small, low fires or none at all, preferring cold to the risk of announcing his position to anyone watching from higher ground. Each successful run deepened the trust that officers and traders placed in him and hardened his own expectation that he would finish what he started regardless of obstacles. Life away from the trail took shape as well. By the year 1846, Thomas married Maria Pasquala Bernal, a young woman from a family rooted deeply in the region. Their home near Arroyo Hondo sat within reach of the mill yet lay apart from its constant noise. Adobe walls held warmth during cold nights and stayed cool during the heat of long summer days. Irrigation ditches carried water from the stream to small plots where Pasquala coaxed beans, corn, and vegetables from the soil. Chickens scratched in the yard, and a few animals grazed on nearby land. Even when Thomas rode out on long assignments, signs of his work showed around the property in stacked firewood, repaired tools, and the trimmed edges of corrals and fences. The marriage tied him more tightly to New Mexican society. Pasquala's relatives visited regularly, sharing meals and news. Among them were distant cousins of families such as the Espinosas, connections that at the time meant only shared bloodlines and neighborhood ties. Conversations at the table moved easily between Spanish and English. Stories of older conflicts and long-standing grievances surfaced when elders spoke. Thomas listened and learned how deeply many residents resented new American authority, and how past losses weighed on families that had already survived earlier wars and political shifts. As the Mexican War unfolded and United States control tightened, tension in the region grew. New officials set policies and collected taxes. Local leaders who cooperated with the occupying forces walked a narrow line between neighbors and foreign soldiers. In taverns and courtyards, men muttered over cups of liquor, lowering their voices when uniforms passed nearby. Rumors of planned uprisings and reprisals moved with every traveler. Working for Turley and accepting courier assignments placed Thomas in a position where he dealt directly with representatives of the new power while living among people who felt its pressure daily. He attended to each task without complaint, focusing on survival rather than politics. Yet he could not ignore the rising strain in the valley. By the end of 1846, winter settled over the mountains surrounding Taos and Arroyo Hondo. Snow crept down the high slopes and gathered on rooftops. The mill wheel turned in cold water, sending its steady rumble through walls where workers warmed stiff hands near the stills. On dark evenings, men gathered more often in the distillery's common room, talking in low tones. Some cast hard looks at any sign of American authority, even when represented only by a courier who carried sealed orders rather than a sword or badge. Thomas moved through this environment with the same awareness he brought to the trail. He kept his weapons close, paid attention to shifts in mood among customers, and sensed that the next year would bring events unlike anything he had yet faced. Dawn on January 19, 1847 brought a hard cold that lay over the Taos Valley in unmoving air. Snow lay crusted in ruts and along rooftop edges, and smoke from cook fires rose straight into still air. In Don Fernando de Taos, men hostile to the new American authorities moved quietly through twisting lanes toward the house of the territorial governor. Their plans shaped during long nights of private meetings. Farther north, near Arroyo Hondo, at the mill and distillery where he had worked through earlier seasons, Thomas Tate Tobin went through winter tasks without yet knowing that the valley had shifted into open revolt. Word reached him not through formal announcement but through the shock carried by travelers. News from town spread across the countryside within hours. Governor Charles Bent had been dragged from his home, pierced with arrows and scalped before his family. Other officials tied to the occupying power lay dead, killed with guns and knives inside their houses or in the street. Names familiar to anyone who moved between Taos and surrounding settlements now hung in the air, as examples to neighbors who had considered cooperating with the new regime. In kitchens, courtyards, and trading rooms, conversations dropped to low voices or stopped entirely. Tobin understood that this was not an isolated killing. Grievances that he had heard in fragments from local families now took violent form. Pueblo fighters under Tomas Romero and Hispano insurgents rallied by Pablo Montoya had struck symbols of American rule in a coordinated blow. The same anger that fueled those attacks could easily turn against traders, trappers, and workers seen as aligned with the new order. Turley's operation at Arroyo Hondo stood out as such a target. Its owner supplied whiskey and goods to American troops and to men who dealt regularly with them. The mill held stores and weapons behind stout walls, but it also sat alone in the open, a fixed point in a valley where hostile forces had begun to move. On the morning of January 20th, watchers at the mill saw a body of riders and footmen gathering on nearby rises and along the road. Dust and powder smoke scented the air. Flags, blankets, and firearms showed within the moving crowd that advanced toward the compound. Reports later put their number at 500, a force drawn from Pueblo villages and Hispanic communities stirred to fight. Inside the mill yard, the defenders had only Simeon Turley and a small group of mountain men and workers, fewer than a dozen. Among them stood Tobin, armed with a rifle that he knew well but surrounded by odds that could not be balanced by marksmanship alone. Before the first shots, a messenger came forward under a sign of parley and demanded surrender. Turley refused to yield his post. Within moments, the siege began. Men on the outside took cover behind low walls, trees, and frozen banks of earth, firing toward windows and doors. The defenders positioned themselves at vantage points within the mill and distillery structures, returning fire through loopholes and from upper openings. Powder smoke built inside rooms that already smelled of grain dust and liquor vapor. Flintlocks and percussion rifles thundered and cracked, and lead struck adobe with heavy thuds, sending chips into the air. Tobin moved from point to point under shouted directions, stepping over spent cartridges and broken glass, reloading and firing with a rhythm honed by years of trail work. He picked targets who showed themselves in the open, aiming at men who directed others or who pressed nearest to the walls. Each shot had to count. There was no way to replace lost ammunition. Outside, attackers shouted insults and curses in Spanish and Tiwa, taunting the men inside and calling for the buildings to be taken and burned. The siege tightened as more of the assailants found covered positions that gave them clear lines of fire toward the windows. At some stage during the day's fighting, Charles Audebys left Turley's compound as a messenger toward Santa Fe, carrying news of the revolt and the attack on the mill. His departure reduced the number of experienced fighters inside the walls, but offered the only chance to bring help. As the hours passed, defenders fell. Some died outright from gunshots that punched through doors or caught them at windows. Others went down wounded, bleeding in corners where they tried to keep reloading. Tobin stepped around men he had known through long seasons of travel and labor, knowing there was no time for ceremony or last words. Survival depended entirely on keeping pressure on the attackers for as long as possible. Late in the day, the besiegers shifted tactics. Realizing that frontal assault through doors and windows carried too high a cost, they set fire to outbuildings and fences. Flames climbed through dry wood and thatch, sending sparks onto main structures that had weathered many winters but had never faced an organized attempt to destroy them. Smoke thickened until vision shrank to narrow cones. Heat pressed through walls and ceilings. The defenders' fields of fire narrowed as rooms filled with choking fumes. Every movement drew on strength that had already been taxed by hours of constant alertness and exertion. As darkness approached, the balance inside the compound changed. The Americans and Allied workers who remained upright could no longer cover every angle. Areas once controlled by rifle fire fell silent as men either died or withdrew deeper into the structures. The attackers sensed this shift and drew closer, using darkness and smoke as cover. Shots from outside now came from short distances. Flames licked at roof beams. The roar of burning wood mixed with shouts and the crack of firearms. The mill, which had stood for years as a place of trade and rough shelter, became a position with no safe way out for the remaining defenders. At some point in this chaos, Tobin faced a decision that many men in enclosed positions have encountered in wartime. Staying meant certain death by bullet or fire when the walls finally gave way. Breaking out meant stepping into open ground that hostile fighters watched. He chose the path that offered at least a small chance of life. Waiting for a moment when the attacker's attention fixed on other windows, he slipped toward a less exposed opening and dropped to the ground outside. Smoke and darkness covered his movement. He landed hard on frozen earth, rolled to avoid silhouetting himself against the burning building, and crawled into the deep shadows cast by outbuildings that had not yet ignited. Moving away from the blaze required every skill he had accumulated across years of hunting and scouting. Firelight behind him threw shifting glows across the yard, threatening to reveal any sudden motion. Voices in Spanish shouted directions, and sporadic gunfire flashed as men fired into the mill and its shapes they thought might be fleeing defenders. Tobin kept his body low and chose routes that hugged depressions in the ground, sliding along irrigation ditches and shallow washes that angled away from the compound. Cold air cut his lungs. The smell of burned wood and spilled alcohol clung to his clothes. Once clear of the yard, he did not stand to run in open view. He climbed slowly up rough slopes, using rocks and brush for concealment. Only when distance and darkness shielded him from direct observation did he increase his pace. Behind him, Turley's mill and distillery burned as the attackers completed their work, killing the remaining defenders and destroying the buildings. Later accounts fixed the number of dead at nearly every man who had stayed inside. Only Tobin and another survivor, John Albert, escaped that day-long slaughter alive. Each left on foot, alone, trusting to knowledge of the land and to habits built from countless small choices made correctly under lesser strain. Tobin moved north and west through cold terrain that he knew from hauling freight and running messages. Snow crunched under his boots. Patches of ice on shaded paths forced him to place his weight carefully to avoid falls that could break bones and leave him helpless. He drank from streams when he could reach them without exposing himself on open banks and ate what little food he had carried from the mill before the siege reached its peak. Sleep came in short stretches under brush or against rocks, without fire. Even a faint glow would have drawn attention in a valley now filled with men on the move. When he reached settlements where American authority held, Tobin found that word of the revolt had already arrived. News of the killings at Taos and the destruction of Turley's place had come from multiple directions. Panic mixed with anger among soldiers and officials who had believed the territory secure. Columns of troops began preparing to march north under Colonel Sterling Price. Volunteers gathered as well, many of them traders and mountain men who had lost friends or business in the revolt. Among them stood Seren St. Vrain, now raising a company to accompany the regular forces. Tobin reunited with his half-brother within this gathering of armed men. Both had suffered personal loss through the events at Taos and Arroyo Hondo, and both understood the countryside better than most of the officers who now studied maps and discussed routes. When St. Vrain called for scouts who knew the arroyos, passes, and villages between Santa Fe and Taos, the brothers stepped forward. Their work would not center on hunting game or carrying trade goods. The task now was to locate insurgent bands and guide military columns to positions from which those bands could be killed or captured. The march north toward Taos moved through country that Tobin had traveled in quieter seasons. This time the rhythm differed. Soldiers tramped in formation along frozen roads. Howitzers rolled behind teams that strained against icy ruts. Civilians rode at the column's edges in loose groups, their clothing and weapons a mix of frontier styles. Tobin ranged ahead and to the flanks, searching for sign of movement. Footprints, hoof marks, and campfire remains told him where insurgent parties had passed and whether they lingered nearby or had already shifted elsewhere. Near Canada, the column met armed resistance. Insurgents had positioned themselves behind walls, in houses, and among irrigated fields that offered cover. Under fire from those positions, regular troops and volunteers had to cross open ground cut by ditches and low banks. Tobin and the other scouts pointed out routes that offered the least exposure, steering groups along depressions and through orchards where trunks provided partial shelter. When soldiers advanced, he stayed close enough to continue reading the ground, calling attention to fresh tracks that indicated attempts to reposition or withdraw. The engagement ended with the defenders driven back, leaving dead and wounded where they had tried to make a stand. Farther north near Embudo, insurgent fighters took up positions in a narrow defile where steep slopes and heavy brush favored ambush. The path wound between rock walls that gave attackers perfect vantage points above. Advancing blindly into that channel would have given a clear advantage to every rifleman hidden among the boulders. Scouts examined side draws and ridges until they found ways to flank the position. Tobin climbed rough ground with small groups of volunteers, leading them along ledges where they could come down on the defenders from unexpected directions. When the fighting started, close-range volleys and hand-to-hand clashes replaced distant exchanges of fire. The men who had aimed to halt the American advance in that pass could not withstand pressure from multiple angles and broke, leaving the route open. The campaign reached its central violence at Taos Pueblo. Insurgents withdrew into the thick walls of the Church of San Geronimo and surrounding structures, trusting adobe to shield them from small arms. Price's troops brought artillery to bear. Under cloudy winter skies, the guns began pounding the church walls, sending dust and fragments into the air. St. Vrain's volunteers, including the hunters and traders who had signed on as his emergency brigade, held positions to cut off escape routes toward surrounding hills. Tobin's role as scout continued in these final stages. He moved among the volunteers, studying terrain for paths that fighters inside the pueblo might use if they tried to slip away during the bombardment. When artillery fire opened breaches and smoke poured from shattered sections of the church, soldiers stormed the gaps. Fighting inside and around the structure turned brutal. Men fired at enemies only a few steps away, struck with rifle butts, and used knives when weapons misfired or ammunition ran out. Behind that close combat, scouts and volunteers maintained the outer cordon, watching for fugitives who tried to run. Shots rang out whenever figures emerged from side doors or low openings and attempted to sprint toward broken ground. The attackers showed no interest in allowing leaders of the revolt to melt back into villages and hills. In the aftermath of the assault on the pueblo, rebel casualties covered the area around the church and lay piled among the ruins of its walls. Prisoners taken from inside and from surrounding villages faced quick military trials that ended in death sentences for many. Judges and translators worked under pressure from officers who viewed the revolt as a direct challenge to new authority rather than as a local dispute. Executions followed on the plaza at Taos, where gallows rose and ropes swung under the weight of condemned men. The Pueblo leader Romero died earlier, shot in custody by a dragoon who acted without orders from the court. Throughout these events, Tobin continued to serve as a man whose skills centered on finding people who did not wish to be found. St. Vrain's company and the regular troops relied on scouts to identify hideouts, mountain paths, and villages where fugitives still loyal to the revolt might gather. Tobin rode along ravines through wooded slopes and into side canyons, examining every track and discarded object that might point toward surviving bands. When patriots from Mora and other communities attempted to regroup, the pursuing forces had guides whose knowledge of the land neutralized many of the advantages that local fighters might otherwise have held. By the latter part of 1847, organized resistance had been broken. The price had been high in deaths on both sides. Homes lay damaged, and relationships among the various communities in northern New Mexico carried fresh wounds. For Tobin, the months since the siege at Turley's Mill had sharpened a particular line of work. He had tracked and fought men whose primary goal was to kill agents and supporters of the new regime. He had watched what happened when groups confident in their local strength met artillery and disciplined volleys supported by fieldcraft supplied by scouts. After the main fighting ended, Tobin shifted toward a quieter life for a time. He moved north to farm on land along the San Carlos River southeast of El Pueblo, raising crops that he sold to Lieutenant Colonel William Gilpin and his troops near Bent's Fort. Even there, his reputation followed him. Officers who bought his produce knew that he had survived the destruction of Turley's operation and that he had ridden with St. Vrain's men during the campaign. They saw in him not simply a farmer selling corn or vegetables, but a man who could travel dangerous ground alone and return with information or with enemies accounted for. Those qualities would pull him back into active scouting when new campaigns formed in the coming year. Spring of 1849 found Thomas Tate Tobin working land along the San Carlos River, using a hoe more often than a rifle. Rows of corn, beans, and squash stood in straight lines between narrow ditches that carried snowmelt from the hills. Each furrow, each shovel cut, and each repair to the low banks held a purpose. Army officers stationed nearby at Bent's Fort needed food for soldiers and animals, and they paid in coin for every load that arrived on time. Farming gave Tobin steady work, yet the river valley never felt entirely safe. Trails crossed the region in several directions, and every passing group brought news of trouble from somewhere else. That year, the news that reached his doorway carried a strange mixture of fame and ruin. Colonel John Charles Fremont had taken a party into the mountains to search for a railroad route, ignoring warnings from men who knew the high country during winter. The expedition had pushed into deep snowdrifts west of the Arkansas River and stalled in freezing storms on narrow ridges. Mules had starved, men had collapsed from exhaustion and cold, and hunger had driven them to desperate measures. Survivors staggered toward settlements in small groups, leaving unburied bodies on ridges and in ravines where drifts hid all but a boot or a sleeve. When word of those scattered men reached Tobin and the other frontiersmen in the Arkansas Valley, they did not treat it as distant gossip. They understood exactly what deep snow and thin clothing meant for any party stranded far from shelter. Rescue work began with no need for speeches. Experienced trappers and scouts gathered blankets, food, and spare animals, then rode toward the last known position of the expedition. Tobin joined them, following tracks that storms had half erased and reading the lay of the land to guess where weakened men would drift when they no longer had strength to climb. The searchers moved through timber where branches sagged under heavy snow. Wind drove fine ice crystals against their faces. They checked ravines and ledges for signs of recent fires, fallen packs, or footprints at the edge of frozen streams. In more than one place they found a body curled against a rock outcrop or tree trunk, frozen in the position of a man who had tried to shield his face from the wind during a final rest that had become permanent. Tobin studied each scene carefully, noting how exhaustion had stripped away the decision-making that normally kept travelers alive. Wrong turns had come not from ignorance but from strength pushed past its limit. Not every search ended at a corpse. In a few sheltered spots, the rescuers discovered men from Fremont's party who still breathed. These survivors had built low fires of twisted brush and fed them with scraps of broken gear. Faces hung slack with fatigue. Eyes stared without focus until one of the rescuers spoke a familiar language or pressed food into stiff hands. Tobin helped lift those men onto spare horses or supported them as they stumbled downhill toward cabins and settlements. Each successful retrieval sharpened his understanding of how narrow the line ran between endurance and death in that country. Once the immediate work of rescue ended, Tobin turned back to his own tasks, yet the episode left a clear mark on his thinking. He had watched an expedition led by a celebrated officer fall apart under the combined weight of poor judgment and harsh weather. He had seen how men with more mountain experience than Fremont had offered warnings that went unheeded. The experience hardened Tobin's view that caution mattered more than bravado, and confirmed his belief that careful reading of the land made the difference between walking out of a trap and freezing among the rocks. As gold discoveries in California drew thousands westward through the early 1850s, traffic along the Santa Fe and Cherokee trails increased. Wagon trains carrying families, miners, and merchants rolled out from Missouri in long columns that stretched across the prairie. Many of these travelers had little understanding of the distances involved or of the threats that waited between river crossings and mountain passes. Fearful leaders and worried relatives looked for experienced guides who could shorten the risk, and names like Tobin's came up whenever traders and officers compared notes on reliable men. Tobin accepted work as a guide and scout for emigrant parties that followed routes near his familiar ground. He rode at the front of wagon trains, choosing branches of the trail that offered water, grass, and defensible camping spots. He studied the sky for signs of approaching storms and gauged river levels before committing heavy wagons to crossings. At night, when families huddled near fires, he rode the perimeter with a few trusted riders, watching for movement near the edge of lantern light. Some nights passed in silence. Other nights brought riders who circled at a distance, measuring the train's strength. A careless party would have treated those distant figures as passing strangers. Under Tobin's eye, guards stayed armed and ready until the watchers moved away. Encounters with raiders, thieves, or angry locals rarely followed neat patterns. Horse thieves slipped into camps after midnight, cutting picket ropes and leading animals away without a sound. Tobin responded by tightening routines. He ordered that animals be brought into closer circles at night with ropes passed through heavy rings or tied to wagons and anchored stakes. Guards rotated through shorter watches to keep them alert. On more than one occasion, he caught faint sounds or glimpsed a shadow moving where nothing should move and fired first. The figures that crumpled under those shots occasionally turned out to be hungry men with more desperation than skill. But they had aimed for theft that could have left entire families stranded hundreds of miles from safety. Some threats advanced, openly. On long stretches of prairie, mounted bands sometimes appeared at a distance and rode toward the caravan in loose formation. These groups could be trading parties, or they could be testing the emigrants' nerves. Tobin handled first contact with a stiff posture and an expression that made clear he had no patience for games. He arranged the wagons into a tight circle, placed armed men at visible points, and rode out alone or with one partner to speak with the newcomers. In such meetings, his calm voice and steady hands often diffused tension before it turned to gunfire. When talks failed and weapons cleared their covers, he wasted no time on warnings. Rifles on both sides spoke quickly in flat reports that carried over the grass. The army called on his services whenever it needed eyes ahead of its columns. Officers who had seen him during the Taos campaign remembered a scout who could keep his head under fire and who delivered information in clear, unembellished terms. During campaigns against raiding parties in the late 1840s and early 1850s, he rode far in front of infantry and dragoons, examining the ground for sign. Broken twigs along creek banks, ash pits filled with old bones, and short stretches of trampled grass told him how many people had passed, how long they had stayed, and how recently they had moved on. His reports determined when commanders ordered charges and when they held troops back to avoid ambush. In that role, Tobin operated under few illusions. He understood that many of the groups pursued by the army had grievances that stretched back through generations of encroachment and broken promises. He also understood that raids on isolated ranches and wagon trains left behind burned buildings, dead settlers, and children driven into captivity. His task did not include drawing moral balance sheets. He tracked parties designated as enemies, pointed out where they hid or moved, and then fought alongside soldiers in engagements that left bodies on both sides. The work hardened him further, yet he did not let anger cloud his judgment. Cold attention to tracks, distances, and angles of fire guided his behavior more than emotion. In the early 1850s, plans emerged for a new military post along the western edge of the Sangre de Cristo Range to protect settlers in the San Luis Valley and to guard approaches through the passes. Fort Massachusetts took shape near the base of Blanca Peak, built from adobe and timber under the direction of officers who understood that the valley lay exposed to raids and to winter storms. Tobin arrived there as part of the force of civilian workers and scouts who helped choose routes, locate building materials, and identify water sources for the garrison. Construction at Fort Massachusetts demanded hard effort from dawn until dark. Men cut and hauled logs, dug foundations, and shaped mud for bricks. Wind poured down from snowfields above, carrying a constant chill even in months when the sun warmed the valley floor. Tobin spent days riding out with survey parties to map surrounding ground. He learned the location of small springs hidden in folds of terrain, the narrow arroyos that could funnel an attack, and the ridges that offered clear fields of fire. These trips also revealed scattered homesteads and grazing grounds where future settlers hoped to take root under the fort's protection. Raids did not cease simply because a new fort rose in the valley. Bands of Utes, Jicarilla Apaches, and other groups still followed long-established movement patterns that brought them near the San Luis Valley. Some raiding parties focused on stealing horses and mules, driving them off through high passes where pursuit grew difficult. Others attacked shepherds and isolated adobe huts, leaving dead and wounded behind. When reports of such incidents reached Fort Massachusetts, officers called for scouts to lead detachments in pursuit. Tobin saddled his horse without delay, strapped on weapons, and rode at the head of columns that left the stockade at first light. Pursuit work demanded endurance and precision. Raiding parties often split into smaller groups after attacks, each driving a portion of the stolen livestock along different routes. Tobin studied the main track first, measuring print depth, stride, and the condition of the animals. Fresh sign called for immediate speed. Older tracks meant that raiders had a head start and might already have merged with friendly camps or disappeared into country where trails overlapped. He used hills and high points to scan for dust clouds and for the distant sparkle of sunlight on metal. When he saw patterns that matched retreating bands, he guided soldiers along the most direct routes that offered cover. Fights that resulted from these chases rarely appeared in official reports with much detail. They took place in side canyons, on narrow benches above creeks, or among low ridges where sagebrush limited visibility. Tobin often found himself close enough to smell powder and hear labored breathing as men ducked behind rocks, reloaded, and fired again. He focused on targets who directed others or who tried to rally their companions. A commander might know his name from payrolls and orders, but the individuals who felt the impact of his work saw only a lean man with a steady rifle who had appeared along their line of retreat and turned escape into a killing ground. When the fort's needs shifted from pursuit to larger operations, Tobin's role widened. Officers planning extended campaigns against particular bands or regions needed to know where water could support large groups of men and animals, where passes remained open during different seasons, and which trails offered the fastest approach to suspected hideouts. Tobin rode with these officers during reconnaissance trips, pointing out landmarks and explaining how wind patterns, game movements, and vegetative growth changed during the year. His speech remained concise. He provided information without extra commentary, trusting the officers to fit it into their own plans. Away from military duty, life continued in rough settlement clusters that clung to river bottoms and valley floors. Tobin spent portions of each year among these communities, helping with roundups, trading labor for supplies, and maintaining relationships that kept him informed. Many of his neighbors respected his skills, yet felt uneasy around his calm demeanor. They had heard stories of the Taos campaign, of the siege at Turley's distillery, and of the search for Fremont's survivors. They knew he had guided soldiers to positions from which they could crush resistance. In conversations on porches and in yards, they treated him politely but watched his eyes, reading in them a hardness that did not relax even during quiet moments. That hardness carried into his responses to outright criminal acts along the frontier. Not every threat came from raiding parties tied to tribes in conflict with the United States. Some came from small gangs of thieves and murderers who preyed on travelers regardless of origin. These men drifted between settlements, offering hired labor where convenient and then disappearing after a robbery or killing. Local authorities with limited manpower struggled to track them across long distances. When such men struck within regions where Tobin had influence, residents sometimes turned to him with descriptions and pleas for help instead of relying solely on distant sheriffs. Tobin approached those situations with the same careful method he applied to military pursuits. He gathered precise descriptions of clothing, weapons, horses, and companions. He rode to the scenes of crimes and inspected tracks, noting gait patterns and marks from damaged horseshoes. He spoke with anyone who had seen the suspects leave a settlement or camp, fixing time and direction in his mind. Once he began following a band, he allowed no distractions. Days on the trail stretched into a chain of small decisions, each one based on the angle of a hoofprint, the depth of a campfire ash bed, or the presence of bones from slaughtered animals. When he closed the distance and found the men he sought, he did not announce himself or offer formal challenges. In many cases, he chose positions that gave him a clear first shot. At dawn or in fading light, he sighted carefully and fired on the largest threat in the group, often a leader who wore better clothing or carried more visible weapons. Confusion among the others gave him time to fire again or to move closer under cover. Some targets died before they understood who hunted them. Others tried to run and fell with their backs to him, their boots kicking briefly in dust or grass. Frontier talk later framed such actions as harsh, yet residents who had lost relatives or property to those same men saw in Tobin a protector who did not waste words on men who had already shown their disregard for human life. Through the mid-1850s, the San Luis Valley and the surrounding high country drew more settlers. Mexican families who had farmed there for generations shared the ground with new arrivals from states east of the Mississippi. Conflicts arose over land claims, water rights, and livestock ranges. Tobin watched these changes with an eye trained to see friction before it exploded. He knew that disputes over a narrow strip of pasture could grow into feuds that ended in burned houses and dead men half buried in shallow graves. When neighbors asked him to mediate, he spoke bluntly and pressed both sides toward agreements that reduced the odds of gunfire. Even in those efforts, his reputation as a man who had survived multiple violent campaigns gave weight to his words. By 1858, the Army determined that Fort Massachusetts, hemmed in by steep slopes and battered by harsh weather, sat in a poor position for long-term defense. Plans took shape for a new post lower in the valley, closer to main travel routes and sheltered from some of the worst storms that rolled off the high peaks. Work began on the fort that would become Fort Garland. Tobin, by then a seasoned scout in his mid-30s, participated in the early surveys and in the informal meetings that discussed where soldiers' families, civilian workers, and traders might live. The new site appealed to him for reasons that reached beyond military logic. From its location, he could see open stretches of the San Luis Valley, the course of nearby streams and the lines of travel that would bring freight and mail north from New Mexico and south from the Arkansas. The surrounding ground offered room for small ranches and fields. Families who settled near the fort would need someone who knew every arroyo and ridgeline when trouble came. Tobin recognized that his years of hunting men and guiding soldiers had prepared him not only for campaigns but also for life as a rancher who could respond fast when dangers crossed the valley floor. As construction advanced at Fort Garland and officers made plans for the first garrison to move in, Tobin began to think more seriously of putting down deeper roots nearby. The idea did not involve turning away from conflict. Instead, it meant establishing a base from which he could continue to work as a scout and occasional manhunter while also raising stock and providing for his family. The land along Trinchera Creek, within sight of the emerging fort, drew his attention. The choice he made to settle there in the coming years would tie his name permanently to the valley and set the stage for the most feared manhunt of his life, when the Espinosa killers began their campaign and the army needed one ruthless hunter more than it needed another column of soldiers. In 1858, soldiers and laborers moved up the San Luis Valley to a new site south of the short-lived Fort Massachusetts. The old post lay tight against the flank of Blanca Peak, buried in snow for long stretches each year and ringed by slopes that hemmed in movement. Officers wanted a position farther down on flatter ground, with room for corrals, gardens, and nearby settlements that could supply the garrison. They chose a low rise above the open valley floor within reach of creeks coming out of the Sangre de Cristo range. Adobe would form the walls, cut timber the roofs. For that work, they turned to men who understood the material and the country, including Charles Autobes and his half-brother Thomas Tate Tobin. The San Luis Valley around the chosen site looked open from a distance, but it carried its own hard edges. High peaks walled it on both eastern and western sides. Winds swept down in sudden gusts that cut through clothing and drove sand against exposed skin. Summer sun baked the surface until dust lifted at every step. Nights, even in warm months, turned cold fast once the light faded. Water came in narrow streams that flowed clear in spring and early summer, then dropped to thin trickles when heat and irrigation pulled them down. Adobe buildings that held steady in this environment needed thick walls, firm foundations, and constant maintenance. Autobes originally supervised the civilian crews shaping mud into bricks and raising walls. He knew how to set forms, how long to let bricks cure, and how to build corners that would hold under their own weight. Tobin worked beside him, hauling water, directing teams, and riding out with small groups to cut timber from slopes above the valley. Construction sites mixed uniforms and rough frontier clothing. Soldiers from the 3rd Infantry hauled alongside Hispano laborers from nearby villages and veteran trappers who had turned to wage work. Orders sounded in English and Spanish as men stacked bricks, set beams, and raised the first outlines of the fort that would later be named Garland. Tension simmered in that mix. Old grudges, fresh insults, and simple drunken stupidity could turn a work camp into a knife fight without warning. During one such flare, a quarrel ended with a blade driven into Charles Autobes. The details of the argument lay scattered between conflicting accounts, but its effect stood plain. The man responsible for directing much of the adobe work lay wounded and had to be carried from the site. Construction needed to continue. Officers and contractors turned to Tobin, who already knew every stage of the process and could keep crews moving without drama. He took the job without speeches. At dawn, he checked water sources, brick lines, and timber stocks. Through the day, he moved from crew to crew, correcting sloppy corners, insisting that soldiers unfamiliar with adobe listen to men who had grown up building with it, and making sure no one cut shortcuts that frost and wind would later expose. When someone grumbled, he looked at the man with flat eyes and waited until the complaint died. By autumn, the low rectangle of Fort Garland stood on the valley floor, its adobe walls closing around parade ground, barracks, storehouses, guardhouse, and officers' quarters. The fort did not look grand. It looked functional, which meant it fit the land. Once troops occupied the post, Tobin did not sign on as a regular soldier. He held to his accustomed role as civilian scout and guide. Officers at Fort Garland needed riders who knew every draw and pass between the post and villages scattered along the Rio Culebra, the Conejos, and the Rio Grande. They needed someone who could ride to Taos or to the Arkansas country without losing time, and who could talk clearly with Hispano settlers, Ute headmen, and American traders. Tobin had spent years building that range of skills. His work now shifted between paid scouting assignments and the building of a more settled life, a short ride away from the fort's gate. He chose land along Trinchera Creek, east of the fort, where water could be drawn into ditches with manageable effort, and where grass for horses and cattle grew in tight clumps along the banks. With Pasquala and their children, he raised an adobe house with a low-pitched roof, a few smaller outbuildings and corrals built from posts and crossrails. A small orchard and garden took shape near the main door, protected from wind by stacked brush and short fences. Chickens ranged close to the house, goats and a few milk cows closer to the creek. Horses and a growing number of cattle filled the larger pasture. When the light fell right during late afternoon, a person could stand at the doorway and see the low line of Fort Garland in the distance, with Blanca Peak rising beyond it like a stone wall. Daily life on that place followed strict patterns. Before first light, Tobin moved along the ditch with a shovel, clearing small slides and adjusting gates to send water into different rows. He checked the hobbled horses, glanced at the sky to read cloud cover, and listened for any sound that did not fit the valley's ordinary noises. Inside, Pasquala started coals in the hearth and prepared simple meals that had to stretch for a household of growing children. Spanish and English blended in the house with occasional words and cadence from native languages that had marked her family history. The children learned to carry water, gather fuel, weed fields, and handle small animals under firm guidance from both parents. The ranch lay inside a web of extended family and neighbors. Pasquala came from the Bernal line, which reached into many households across northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. Through her father, Felipe Espinosa y Bernal, she carried ties to Espinosa kin, whose surname would later carry fierce meaning in the valley. Many of those relatives lived in villages west and south of the fort, planting fields under community ditches and running small herds on shared range. They visited each other for baptisms, weddings, and feast days at adobe churches that stood as centers of village life. At those gatherings, Tobin moved among men who shared Pasquala's blood and name, listening more than he spoke, weighing their words as carefully as he weighed any report on the trail. Broader forces tightened around those communities as the 1850s advanced. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had shifted sovereignty across the region, yet courts and land officers working under new laws often treated long-standing Hispano land grants as obstacles rather than settled rights. In the San Luis Valley, the vast Sangre de Cristo grant lay at the center of disputes between original grantees, later claimants, and Anglo speculators interested in timber, grazing, and water. Surveys carved the landscape into papers and lines that did not match the way villagers understood their customary rights. When cases reached court, judges often favored newer arrivals. Families who had grazed animals on certain slopes for generations suddenly heard orders to move their herds or pay for what they had always considered their own ground. Tobin sat at an unusual hinge point in this conflict. He lived as a son-in-law among Hispano families with deep roots in the valley. He also worked for the army and spoke easily with officers whose careers and loyalties tied them to territorial governors and distant superiors. On many days he rode from his ranch to Fort Garland, accepted an assignment, then rode on to villages where relatives of his wife lived under laws they had not chosen. He carried messages from the fort that warned of new regulations, troop movements, or tax demands. He then rode back with reports on raids, missing livestock, and complaints about broken promises. His bearing stayed level in both worlds, but he could not ignore the weight of resentment he saw in the faces of men who watched stranger after stranger claim authority over their land. Separate from the pressure of courts and land offices, the older pattern of raiding and counter-raid continued. Ute and Jicarilla groups still moved along traditional paths that led past the valley. They watched Fort Garland and measured every new building and wagon there. Some traded peacefully, bringing robes and horses to exchange for guns, powder, and manufactured goods. Others, or the same men at other times, struck at isolated herders, taking stock and vanishing into timbered canyons before help could arrive. Navajo raiders ranged farther to the southwest, yet added to the broader sense that no rancher could rest fully easy. When a herd vanished or a family lost animals in a night raid, officers at the fort sent for Tobin. He and a handful of soldiers rode out from the gate at first light, cutting across pasture and dry ground toward the last seen trail. Out beyond irrigated fields, the land lay rough, with washes cut deep by spring melt, patches of brush and scattered rocks that broke hooves. Tobin rode in front, bent slightly forward in the saddle as he studied the faint changes in soil and vegetation that marked the passage of many animals moving fast. He measured stride, spacing, and print depth, reading how hard the stock had been pressed and how fresh the sign remained. He did not always catch the raiders. Sometimes a storm scoured tracks or drove them onto stone where no clear mark remained. On other rides, he mapped enough of their route to tell officers which canyon or basin served as a regular escape corridor. That knowledge guided larger expeditions planned later in the year. When he did close the distance and bring his party within firing reach, the contact unfolded fast and without ceremony. Men crouched behind boulders and low ridges, firing short volleys and then shifting position as bullets chipped stone and snapped branches. Tobin chose his targets by behavior rather than clothing, putting his first shots into men who directed others or who moved to climb onto the best escape horses. Each time that process ended with dead or scattered raiders, a few more families in the valley concluded that he had become the person to call when a trail had to be followed to its end. Not all hunts began with stolen stock. The valley, like every other frontier region, harbored men who preyed on neighbors and travelers without connection to tribal politics or distant wars. Some drifted up from New Mexico, some came down from mining camps, and some slipped away from military posts where discipline had pressed them harder than they could stand. They took advantage of remote cabins, lonely stretches of road, and small stores between settlements. When a shopkeeper failed to open at sunrise or a wagon failed to reach its next stop, searchers sometimes found a body in the doorway or down an embankment, pockets turned out and wagon boxes stripped. Sheriffs and justices in those thinly staffed communities lacked manpower to chase such men far. More than once, a local official or grieving relative rode to Trinchera Creek to ask Tobin for help, offering what money or stock they could gather as payment. He did not turn every request into a formal contract, yet when he accepted a job, he treated it with the same serious focus he brought to army assignments. He gathered descriptions, studied boot and hoof prints at the crime scene, and noted the direction in which the killers had last been seen. Then he went after them, sometimes alone, sometimes with one trusted companion. On those hunts, he moved in a way that offered no comfort to the quarry. He kept his own campfires small and his gear light. He watched for careless trash tossed aside at midday halts and for distinct tobacco smells that hung in sheltered spots where wind failed to clear the air. If he found empty whiskey bottles near a trail, he marked in his mind that the men ahead moved without discipline and might be easier to catch when they slept heavy. Days could pass with nothing more than faint impressions in dust and a few broken twigs. When at last he reached a place where he could see the men he hunted, he did not call out or offer them the chance to sort blame among themselves. He took cover where brush and stone gave him a sure firing position, settled the heavy Hawken rifle against his shoulder, and set his front sight on the chest of the man who appeared to lead. One hard recoil sent a heavy ball through bone and lung. Confusion among the others opened room for further shots. Few of those men reached trial. Their corpses, when brought back across pack saddles, gave families and local officers the only closure they were likely to receive. By the early 1860s, people in the San Luis Valley spoke of Tobin in careful tones. He stood only a little taller than 5.5 feet and weighed far less than some of the soldiers at the fort, yet his presence cut through any room he entered. He favored black clothing when he came in from the ranch, black hat, black shirt, dark trousers and boots polished by use rather than vanity. He rode a dark horse with a plain black saddle. Across his belt hung a large knife suited for skinning animals and for close fighting. An 1851 Navy Colt rode in a buffalo hide holster whose rough hair still showed, and the long Hawken rifle rested wherever he sat. When asked at the fort how many men he had killed in his years on the trails and in fights, he answered simply that 10 lay in the ground by his hand, men from Indian nations, Hispano settlements, and Anglo camps. He did not offer excuses or apology. Inside his own house, he remained a husband and father. Pasquala managed food supplies through hard winters, nursed sick children, and kept a rosary within easy reach. She knew that her kin bore surnames that overlapped with some of the men Tobin would later hunt, including the Espinosas, whose name had begun to circulate more sharply in whispers among valley families. Among Felipe Nerio Espinosa and his relatives, wounds from the Mexican War and from lost land claims festered. Felipe wrote and spoke of family members killed, property seized, and a country taken from under their feet. In his mind, these injuries demanded redress counted in enemy lives, not petitions. That resolve hardened in the same valley where Tobin raised stock and moved between two cultures. Across the winter of 1862 into the first weeks of 1863, snow lay along the flanks of the Sangre de Cristo Range, while cold winds swept the valley floor. At Fort Garland, officers discussed reports from fighting between Union and Confederate forces far to the east. They also read letters from territorial officials worried by rising numbers of killings and robberies in regions outside the valley. Wagons still crossed passes. Miners still pushed toward new districts. Each of those movements carried its share of thieves, desperate men, and angry settlers. The San Luis Valley stood in the path of much of that traffic, a long corridor between New Mexico and the Central Rockies. On his ranch, Tobin kept irrigation ditches open under thin ice and watched the sky for signs of late storms. He repaired fences, branded calves, and checked ammunition stocks. He heard family talk from Pasquala's side of the table, heard names such as Espinosa, Chavez, and Bernal linked to arguments over land, church affairs, and past deaths. He heard soldiers at the fort speak in worried tones about killers who left mutilated bodies in other parts of the territory. The valley felt steady at a glance, yet underneath that surface lay layered grievances, raw fear, and a sense that someone, somewhere, would soon push past the old boundaries of violence. When that happened, the officers at Fort Garland already knew which man they would call, if they needed a trail found and a killer brought down, no matter where he hid. On a cold morning in early March 1863, a freighter named Franklin Bruce drove his wagon team along a rough road near Canyon City, guiding tired animals past rocks and stumps toward the next camp. Snow patches still clung to shaded slopes. Ruts held frozen mud that jarred the wagon with every turn of the wheels. Bruce had hauled freight along that route many times. He knew the short stretches where timber closed in on both sides and where a man could not see more than a few yards ahead. When he turned into one of those narrow sections, riders watched from the trees, waiting for the team and driver to reach the tightest point in the track. The first shot struck with no warning. The ball hit Bruce in the body and threw him from the high seat. He hit the ground hard, stunned and unable to reach for his rifle. The horses reared against their traces, eyes wide, breath steaming in the cold air. More shots cracked from the timber. The driver's body jerked and then lay still. Two men stepped from cover and approached the wagon with deliberate movements. They carried rifles and knives and showed no hurry. One was Felipe Nerio Espinosa, a man from New Mexican villages whose anger toward Anglo authority had hardened over years into a fixed plan. Beside him moved his younger brother Vivian, thinner and quick-eyed, who watched the road ahead for any sign of witnesses. They pulled Bruce's corpse clear of the wheel and dragged it onto the open ground beside the track. Their work on the dead man followed a pattern they had already chosen. They stripped him of valuables, then cut open his clothing with quick strokes. A knife point pressed into his chest, carving a cross into flesh. Blood darkened the cloth. In some killings they cut deeper, opening the body and taking organs as proof to themselves that the act could not be undone. The wagon, animals, and remaining cargo would go to support their movement. The body on the ground served another purpose. It carried a message to anyone who found it that the killers did not stop at simple robbery. When another freighter passed that stretch of road hours later and saw vultures circling, he slowed his team and looked sharply at the brush. He found Bruce's frozen remains and recognized the mutilation as something beyond a drunken attack or a simple quarrel. The cross carved into the chest and the savagery of the cuts left no doubt that someone had meant to send a sign. He gripped his own rifle tighter on the drive into Canyon City and told every person he met in town exactly what he had seen. Merchants, teamsters, and local officials gathered around him, pressing for details. By the time darkness fell, word of the killing had moved through every saloon and boarding house in the small settlement. Over the next week, similar stories blew in from other points across central Colorado territory. A woodcutter who supplied ties to a future rail line failed to return from his work area. Searchers found his body near a stand of pines, stripped of clothing and opened with knife cuts that matched those on Bruce. A lone rider who had left a stage station on a clear morning failed to reach the next stop. His horse turned up later, wandering with the saddle twisted and stained. When men followed its back trail, they discovered his corpse at the bottom of a shallow ravine, shot, mutilated, and left exposed. In each case, the wounds carried a familiar sign. The cross cut into the chest recurred. Some bodies bore further marks that suggested a methodical pattern rather than random rage. The killers did not hurriedly stab their victims and flee. They spent time on the bodies, even in exposed locations. That fact unsettled men who had seen all kinds of violence on the frontier. Robbers who feared pursuit usually grabbed coin and goods quickly and left before anyone could catch them at the scene. Here, whoever did this stayed long enough to carve deliberate symbols into skin. In cabins, camps, and settlements, frightened talk gave the unknown attackers a name even before officials saw clear proof. People spoke of the Espinosas, drawing on stories that had been circulating in Hispano communities in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Felipe's long resentment toward United States rule and territorial courts, his claims of relatives killed by soldiers and of land taken by strangers, and his harsh religious language had made him a problem for priests and alcaldes long before the killings in Colorado. Now that anger had crossed into a campaign against any Anglo traveler unlucky enough to share the same road. Felipe himself made no secret of his justifications when he put pen to paper. In a letter addressed to Colorado's territorial governor, John Evans, he claimed that he had already killed many Americans, and that he intended to kill 600 in total as payment for family members he counted as lost in earlier conflicts. He framed his killings as acts ordered by God, insisting that he carried out a divine command rather than personal revenge. The letter moved through official hands, read and reread by men who struggled to grasp the scale of the threat it described. Its tone lacked hesitation. It did not request negotiation. It announced intent. While officials weighed how to respond, the killings continued. A group of prospectors traveling between camps in South Park found the remains of one of their number beside the trail. His body slashed and his face battered beyond recognition. On another day, a stage station master discovered one of his drivers slumped under a shed, throat cut, with empty holsters hanging from his belt. Personal items that would have meant nothing to anyone else had vanished from his pockets, suggesting that the killers had watched him long enough to know what he carried, then stripped him of everything they wanted. The pattern stretched across a broad swath of territory, from the mountain country near present-day Fairplay to the approaches toward Canyon City and along little-used roads farther south. Corpses turned up with the same marks. Families who lived in scattered cabins between settlements now faced choices that felt narrow. Some stopped traveling entirely unless they could attach themselves to large parties. Others armed everyone in the household who could hold a gun. Children learned to step away from windows at night and to sleep in their clothing, ready to run if a knock sounded at the door after dark. Accounts of the killings reached Fort Garland through soldiers returning from errands and through civilians who used the fort as a point of contact with the wider world. Officers spread maps across tables and marked each reported murder with ink. The dots formed a loose arc through central Colorado that bent toward the San Luis Valley. Although no one had yet caught the killers in the act, the consistency of the wounds and the similar circumstances around each attack made it clear that a small, mobile band was responsible. Rumors named Felipe and Vivian Espinosa as the men behind the rifle shots and knife work. The governor's office began to post rewards for their capture or death. Early efforts to bring them down faltered. Local sheriffs and posses followed tracks that faded into rocky ground, or into stretches of timber broken by countless animal paths. One group of armed citizens rode for days on sign they believed belonged to the brothers, only to find an abandoned shepherd camp with no clear link to the killings. Another party stumbled into a separate band of outlaws who had nothing to do with the Espinosas but who opened fire rather than explain their presence near a canyon mouth. The resulting fight produced more dead men and more confusion without bringing anyone closer to the pair responsible for the territorial killings. The Espinosa's ability to avoid capture came not from luck, but from discipline learned during years spent hunting and traveling in high country. They chose routes that crossed ridges where wind scoured tracks, then dropped into gullies where streams washed away footprints. They camped in thickets and on slopes where anyone approaching would have to break branches or kick loose stones, giving warning. When they needed supplies, they did not trade openly in settlements where their faces might be recognized. Instead, they took what they required from lonely cabins, leaving behind another dead man or family to mark their passage. In April, a posse more determined than most finally cornered them near the mountains west of the South Park region. Soldiers and armed citizens led by officers who had watched the string of killings with growing anger rode hard on a fresh trail. They cut sign where two riders had passed through melting snow, then saw smoke rising from a stand of timber ahead. Moving in a rough semicircle, they approached the camp from several angles, rifles at the ready. Shots erupted at close range when Felipe and Vivian realized they had been found. The exchange of fire ended with Vivian dead on the ground. He lay face down, blood soaked through his shirt where a ball had passed through his chest. His rifle lay just beyond his outstretched hand. Felipe, wounded, burst from cover and ran for his horse. Bullets struck bark and kicked up dirt around him. He vaulted into the saddle, slammed his heels into the animal's flanks, and drove it down slope through brush before anyone could cut him off. Pursuers fired until he vanished behind trees and rocks. They found only scattered drops of blood and a broken branch where he had forced the horse through a tight gap. Standing over Vivian's corpse, the posse members hoped that the campaign of killings had ended. They recognized him as one of the brothers named in the governor's reward notices. Some cut locks of his hair or took his clothing as proof to present to authorities. The body itself went into a shallow grave, scraped out with knives and boot heels. Men who had ridden hard to reach that camp returned home believing they had broken the pair who had terrorized central Colorado. Reports reached towns and forts claiming that the Espinosa problem had been solved on that day. Those reports proved wrong. Felipe retreated injured, angry, and more determined. In the San Luis Valley and the hills around it, he found shelter among kin who shared his resentment. There he spoke not in hushed regret but in hard terms of vengeance. He had lost a brother to American bullets. That loss joined a list of grievances he already carried from older wars and land disputes. He refused to accept that his campaign had ended. Instead, he sought another partner. He turned to his young nephew, Jose, a teenager with less experience than Vivian but with equal loyalty to family. Felipe placed a rifle in his hands and taught him how to move alone through broken country, how to sleep without fire in freezing weather, and how to prepare an ambush along roads where wagons and riders passed at predictable hours. Jose listened and absorbed each lesson, stepping into a role that gave him power in a struggle he understood through family stories of humiliation and loss. Together, uncle and nephew resumed the pattern the brothers had begun, striking now with more fury. The second phase of the killings focused more heavily on the region nearer to the Sangre de Cristo range and the approaches to the San Luis Valley. A group of men hauling supplies through a pass south of present day. La Veta failed to arrive at their destination. Searchers found their wagon abandoned on a narrow ledge. Team animals gone, and the bodies of the drivers lying nearby with the same cross carved into the flesh. A herder moving a small flock along a side route disappeared. His flock scattered and drifted back toward known grazing grounds. When neighbors followed the returning animal's tracks, they discovered his corpse under low branches of a spruce. Rifle missing, chest slashed. Each new killing fueled a wave of fear stronger than the last. By now, residents knew that initial reports of the band's defeat had been false. The name Espinosa returned to conversations with a sharper edge. Men at stage stations laid extra rifles across their laps and kept their eyes on the timber whenever a traveler approached. Some stage lines cut back on runs through the most dangerous stretches, shifting schedules or closing certain routes entirely. Merchants in Denver, Canyon City, and smaller settlements faced delays in deliveries and saw customers hesitate to risk roads where they once traveled without thinking. Even outlaws who normally focused on robbery and smuggling shifted their behavior. Word of the killing spread along the same currents that carried news of good robberies and failed raids. Men who had no qualms about holding up a stage in New Mexico or stealing stock near Bent's old trading ground now spoke of the Espinosa campaign with unease. The brothers and then the uncle and nephew had shown no interest in robbery alone. They treated each encounter with an Anglo traveler as a chance to fulfill a vow framed in numbers and in blood. Criminals who usually thought of themselves as hunters now imagined an adversary who would never bargain and who moved with an intensity shaped by his own long trail of survival. Inside Fort Garland, officers who had earlier watched killings in distant counties now saw the pattern draw closer. Reports of murders near passes that led directly into the San Luis Valley put the fort's garrison on full alert. Patrols extended farther into the hills. Couriers rode between the fort and settlements with instructions for ranchers to keep closer guard on their roads. The name Felipe Espinosa appeared more often in written orders and memoranda. The governor's rewards increased, promising money and honor to anyone who could kill or capture him and his new partner. Tobin, working his ranch on Trinchera Creek, did not need formal reports to understand the change. Riders from nearby villages stopped at his gate to share stories of bodies found on high roads, of families too frightened to send children to distant fields alone, and of men who now refused to travel without company. He saw the fear etched in their faces and heard the way voices dropped when they said the name Espinosa. He knew that his wife's kinship network touched the same families whose sons and cousins now spoke of vengeance and defense. One afternoon, a small group of soldiers rode to his house from the fort, dust caked on their trousers and faces set in tight lines. They carried a message from their commanding officer calling Tobin to Fort Garland for a meeting. The officer wanted more than general advice. He wanted the services of a manhunter who had survived the Taos Revolt, guided troops in difficult campaigns, and tracked killers over long distances without losing them. The Espinosa campaign had shaken ordinary posses and scattered untrained pursuers. To end it, the army now turned toward a single quiet figure on a ranch within sight of the adobe walls. A man whose name already carried weight among soldiers, settlers, and the few outlaws who had heard stories of what happened when he joined a hunt. By late summer of 1863, the killings, the failed chases, and the spreading fear had built a pressure that bore down on every community between Denver and the San Luis Valley. Trails that once carried simple commerce now felt like corridors of risk. Black crosses carved into cold flesh lay behind the rumors, giving them hard edges. The territory had reached a point where another random posse or half-planned expedition would no longer satisfy the need for action. The stage was set for a different kind of pursuit, one guided not by large numbers of men but by one tracker whose patience matched the killer's determination. The decision to call him into the campaign would turn the Espinosa story from one of unchecked murder into one of a relentless hunt that even hardened outlaw bands watched with unsettled respect. In the first days of October 1863, a courier rode into Fort Garland from the north, with frost on his mustache and fear in his eyes. He swung out of the saddle in the parade ground and told the guard that 2 more men lay dead in the Sangre de Cristo country, shot down on a narrow road and cut open in the same brutal fashion that had already become a dark signature across Colorado territory. Crosses carved into chests, clothing slashed, bodies left in the open beside abandoned teams. His words moved from the gate to headquarters faster than he could catch his breath. Colonel Samuel Tappan listened in his office while the courier repeated the story in clipped phrases. The officer's gaze shifted from the man to the map spread across the table between them. Ink marks already dotted that map at places where the Espinosas had killed earlier victims near Canyon City and South Park, and along lesser roads between settlements. Now Tappan added a fresh point in the high country that guarded the northern approach to the San Luis Valley. The pattern no longer lay far from the post. It had crept down the map until it pressed against the region that Fort Garland was supposed to protect. Sheriffs, posses, and volunteer parties had already failed. They had trailed the killers until tracks vanished in stone, or they had blundered into the wrong camps and come home with bodies that did nothing to halt the murders. Tappan had read their reports and heard their excuses. He needed someone who did not guess at sign, someone who read tracks as clearly as printed ink. One name came to mind, a man who lived within sight of the fort and whose record as a tracker stretched back through the Taos Revolt and a long string of frontier campaigns. Tappan sent a sergeant and 2 troopers toward Trinchera Creek with instructions to bring in Thomas Tate Tobin at once. They found him in his yard near the creek, bent over a saddle horse while one of his boys held the lead rope. His shirt and hat carried dust from field work. The long Hawken rifle leaned in the shadow of the house, close enough to reach in one stride. When the soldiers delivered the summons, Tobin straightened, glanced toward the adobe walls of Fort Garland in the distance, and nodded once. He told his son to finish with the horse and to heed his mother, then stepped inside to gather his gear. He emerged with his rifle, the 1851 Navy Colt in its buffalo hide holster, the long knife at his belt, and a small roll of bedding. He mounted without further talk and rode with the soldiers toward the fort. There, in the headquarters room that smelled of ink, dust, and wool uniforms, he sat across from Tappan while the colonel explained the situation in plain terms. The Espinosa killings had continued despite every earlier chase. The latest victims lay north of the valley. The territorial governor had authorized a large reward for the killers, dead or alive. No officer wanted a failed chase, added to that pile of defeats. Tappan asked whether Tobin would take the job. The question held no flourish. The colonel knew that the man before him made decisions without bluster. Tobin answered with the same flat tone he used when accepting any hard task. He would go. He wanted only a few soldiers along at the start and the freedom to leave them behind when the time came to move silently. He wanted ammunition, a short supply of food and fresh horses where they could be reached if the trail ran long. The colonel agreed to each point, then counted out advance pay from a small strongbox and pushed it across the table. Before sunset, a detachment of troopers at the post saddle racks prepared under Tobin's direction. He checked each cinch, rope, and strap, making sure that nothing would fail at a bad moment. His own dark horse, used to rough ground and long days, stood steady while he loaded coffee, flour, salt, a little bacon, and spare cartridges into worn saddlebags. The Hawken lay across the saddle where his hand could fall on it in an instant. The pistol rested on his hip. The knife he had used in many earlier fights hung at his belt, its edge honed thin. He wore the familiar black hat and dark clothing that soldiers already associated with his presence. They left Fort Garland at first light the next morning. Frost silvered the grass along the irrigation ditches. Breath steamed from the horses' nostrils. Behind them, the fort's adobe walls and flagpoles shrank as they crossed the open floor of the San Luis Valley. Ahead rose the long spine of the Sangre de Cristo Range, slope streaked with yellow aspen and darker pine. High peaks bearing fresh snow that glowed in the cold morning sun. The road toward the passes wound through low sage and scattered willows, then began to climb through broken ridges cut by shallow draws. Tobin led the way at a steady pace that preserved the horse's strength. When the land grew rough, he rose slightly in the stirrups to save his mount's back. He spoke little. At times he asked the troopers what they had heard concerning the men they hunted. They answered with bits of rumor and exaggerated tales picked up in saloons and mess halls, stories that turned the Espinosas into figures who could move without sound and slip through stone. Tobin let the talk run its length, then stated in a few words that the killers were flesh and blood. They needed food, water, and sleep, and they left sign whenever they moved. By midday, the party reached the place where the most recent ambush had taken place. The bodies had already been buried beside a stand of scrub pines, but wagon ruts still marked the track and blood darkened the frozen mud near the edge of the road. Bits of torn cloth had caught on low brush. Birds circled above and settled from time to time to pick at scraps that scavengers had dragged from the disturbed earth. Under Tobin's direction, the troopers led their horses off the track and waited while he moved through the area on foot. He walked in slow circles, head bent, eyes scanning every mark. Boot heels had gouged deep furrows in one spot where a man had braced to fire a long gun. Another patch showed the scuffed pattern of a body dragged from one point to another. Hoofprints of the wagon team overlapped with two distinct sets of saddle horse tracks. Those horse prints led away from the scene toward a narrow side trail that climbed into the hills. Tobin followed them, counting strides and noting where the riders had slowed to pick their way through rock or to cross shallow washes. The distance between the prints never changed. Two men riding close, moving with practiced care. The trail pulled the party from the main road into country where low ridges rose on either side. Pines and spruce crowded the slopes. Ravines cut sharply between them, carrying meltwater down toward the valley in thin streams. In that kind of ground, a large group created more noise than any careful hunter would tolerate. Horses stumbled on loose stone. Scabbards and buckles knocked faintly with every stride. The sounds bounced off rock walls and drifted ahead. Near a narrow defile where the path squeezed between boulders, Tobin stopped and turned in his saddle. He told the sergeant that from that point forward the soldiers would remain behind. He ordered them to make a small camp in a sheltered hollow, to keep fires as low as possible, and to hold their position unless they heard gunfire close at hand. If shots came, they were to move with caution and wait for clear sight of friend and enemy before pressing forward. The sergeant, no stranger to the value of a quiet scout, accepted the instructions without argument. Tobin stripped his load to essentials, kept his rifle, pistol, knife, blanket, and a little food, and led his horse up a faint side path until trees hid the camp from view. Alone, he could move in near silence. He dismounted often and walked beside the horse, placing each hoof on firm ground, avoiding loose stones and dry branches that might crack under weight. He stayed in the shadow of ridges when the sun dipped, using that same light to examine distant slopes for smoke or movement, while keeping his own outline off the skyline. Crows and magpies often told the truth of death before any human eye saw it. Late in the day, Tobin noticed a cluster of such birds wheeling over a hillside ahead, spiraling in a loose pattern that rarely formed without a carcass on the ground below. He studied their movement, then angled toward them, keeping to cover. The smell hit him before he reached the crest, a rank mix of blood and opened guts. He tied his horse in a patch of scrub where it could not be seen from lower ground and went forward on foot, rifle ready. From the shoulder of the hill he could see into a shallow basin ringed with low pines. In the center lay the remains of an ox, hide peeled back, ribs standing bare where meat had been cut away with sharp knives. Around it, boot prints and hoof marks pressed into the soft earth. Two distinct sets of boot tracks moved in loops between the carcass, a small fire ring, and the place where horses had been hobbled. The ashes in the fire pit still held a little warmth when he placed his hand near them. The killers had eaten there, rested, then ridden on toward higher ground. There was no need to disturb the camp. Tobin backed away, returned to his horse, and moved off far enough to find his own shelter. He chose a hollow out of the wind, led the horse into it, and settled down with the blanket wrapped tight around his shoulders. He built no fire. Cold bacon and dry bread served as his meal. The night air bit through cloth and wool, but exposure meant less than the risk of a visible flame. He slept in short stretches, waking often to listen. Wind moved in the trees. Once something small rustled through brush nearby and then fled at his shifting weight. No human voice or hoof sound broke the dark. Before dawn he was back on the move. The basin with the slaughtered ox looked different in the thin gray light. Fresh hoof marks scarred the damp ground near the old tracks. The men he hunted had returned in the night to slice away more meat, then gone on. The new trail led into a narrow drainage that climbed toward thicker timber. Tobin followed, stepping from rock to rock where prints thinned, then dropping into soft soil patches where they appeared again as clear impressions. His breath misted in front of his face each time he paused to study the sign. After hours of climbing, he eased over a final low rise and looked down into a sheltered meadow enclosed by dense trees. Thin smoke from a small fire rose straight into the still air. 2 horses grazed near the edge of the clearing, saddles on the ground, reins dragging. Near the fire, a stocky man knelt with his back partly turned, hat pushed back as he cut meat into narrow strips. A younger man sat close by, cross-legged, a rifle laid across his lap as he ran a cloth along its barrel. Their posture told the story. They believed themselves alone. Tobin slid back from the crest, tied his horse in thicker brush where it would remain out of sight, and returned on foot with his rifle held low. He moved from tree to tree, then from boulder to boulder, the approach measured and patient. When he found a fallen log that offered both cover and a solid rest for the Hawken, he settled behind it and took a careful look at the men in the clearing. The older man's face matched descriptions that had crossed every camp and village in the valley. Heavy mustache, hard eyes, a set to the jaw that spoke of stubborn resolve. Felipe Nerio Espinosa stood beside the fire that morning, knife in hand, tending his meal as if no one hunted him. The younger figure, Jose, watched the horses now and then, but never the tree line. Tobin took his time. He wiped the front sight with thumb and forefinger, steadied the rifle on the log, and drew the butt into his shoulder. Felipe's ribs filled the notch on the barrel. The scout let air out of his lungs until his chest felt still, then pressed the trigger. The Hawken roared. Smoke jumped from the muzzle and drifted sideways in the still air. Felipe jerked as the ball struck high in his side. The knife flew from his hand. He toppled onto the ground, rolling once before coming to rest on his back. At the fire, Jose snapped upright, eyes wide, hands grabbing for the rifle in his lap. Tobin reloaded with movements drilled into muscle over many fights. Powder, patch, ball, the long ramrod driving the charge home, cap seated on the nipple. Jose staggered to his feet and tried to swing his own weapon toward the tree line. The second shot cracked across the meadow and hit him square in the chest. He stumbled backward, heels tangling in loose stones, and fell hard near the fire, the rifle spinning away. Silence followed, broken only by the small crackle of burning wood and the startled snort of one of the grazing horses. Tobin waited a few heartbeats, watching for any sign of a third man. There was none. He rose from behind the log and walked down into the clearing, rifle held ready. Felipe lay on his back, shirt soaked in blood, eyes already fixed. The ball had smashed through his ribs and lodged deep. Tobin nudged the body with his boot to confirm that no movement remained, then crossed to Jose. The younger man still breathed in shallow pulls, blood bubbling at the hole in his chest. His gaze tracked the approaching figure with a mixture of hatred and stubborn pride. There would be no recovery from a wound like that in such a place. Leaving him alive would mean leaving a crippled killer to whatever family might find him. Tobin drew his knife across the exposed throat in one swift stroke and waited until the chest stilled. The work that followed tested a different kind of endurance. Tobin collected rifles, pistols, knives, and ammunition, setting them in a neat stack on a flat rock. He searched Felipe's pockets and belt and found folded papers, scraps of writing, and a devotional image that matched descriptions given by men who had seen the earlier letter sent to Governor John Evans. Those documents and personal items would help prove who had died in this meadow. Proof alone would not satisfy officials. In this terrain, bodies rotted quickly. Animals scattered bones. Snow erased features. Rumor thrived where clear evidence lacked. Tobin understood that argument and chose a harder course. He rolled Felipe's body slightly, set his knife at the neck, and cut through skin, muscle, and gristle until the head came free. It took strength and time even for a man accustomed to slaughter pens and battlefield work. He wrapped the head in cloth and set it aside, then did the same to Jose. Both faces would still be recognizable when he reached the fort. Blood darkened the ground near the fire, flies already gathered despite the cool air. Tobin cleaned, his hands and knife in a nearby stream, scrubbing until the water around his fingers ran clear. He looked once more around the camp to ensure that nothing useful remained for any future criminal band, then haltered one of the horses as a pack animal. The wrapped heads and the gathered papers went into a secure bundle lashed tight to the saddle. When he led the pack horse back to the spot where his own mount waited, the sun stood past midday. He climbed to a ridge and looked back at the meadow. 2 bodies lay near the butchered ox, alone in their last camp. No cross would rise over that ground. The memory of their work would travel instead in the stained bundle tied behind his saddle and in the stories of settlers who had walked for months in fear of their rifles and knives. Tobin rode down toward the hollow where the troopers waited. Hooves clinked on stone, leather creaked softly. Near the camp he gave a sharp whistle. Soldiers stepped from behind trees with rifles ready. Their eyes went directly to the bundle on the pack horse. The cloth had already begun to darken where fluid soaked through. No one spoke for a moment. Then Tobin told them to break camp and saddle up. The job they had started now stood finished. The group turned south, following the same passes and ridges they had used on the way in. Night caught them before they reached the valley floor. They chose a sheltered draw, unsaddled, and lay down without fire. The pack horse stood tied close to Tobin's bedroll. Even in darkness, the faint smell from the bundled heads reached every man in the hollow. Sleep came slowly to the troopers. Tobin closed his eyes and rested as he had on many earlier trails, weapon within arm's reach, mind already moving toward the next step, which lay in the adobe walls that waited for him in the San Luis Valley. The following day, the walls of Fort Garland rose again above the flat land. A lookout on the ramparts spotted the returning party and sent word down to the parade ground. Soldiers stepped out from barracks and stables as Tobin led the lathered horses through the gate. Dust streaked his black clothing. Dried blood stained the pack horse's flank where the bundle rubbed. Colonel Tappan walked out from headquarters and stopped near the center of the yard while the little column drew up before him. Faces lined the edges of the ground, men from the garrison and civilians from nearby, all fixing their attention on the stained load lashed behind the scout's saddle. The long trail of the Espinosas ended there in a quiet moment before the bundle came down and the watching valley learned exactly what one ruthless hunter had carried out of the high timber. 1863 to 1868. The sun stood high above Fort Garland when Tom Tobin rode into the parade ground with the burlap sack still tied behind his saddle. Dust hung in the still air of the San Luis Valley, stirred by the hooves of his black horse as it clopped past adobe walls and stacked firewood. Troopers who had spent months hearing rumors of the Espinosa killers watched the quiet tracker dismount, stretch stiff legs, and hand his reins to a stable hand as if returning from a routine errand. Not from a hunt that had ended in blood and beheading in the timbered slopes of the Sangre de Cristo range. Inside the commandant's office, the room smelled of lamp oil, ink, and wool uniforms warmed by the afternoon. A map of the territory covered one wall, lines of rivers and trails traced in fading pencil. Tom set the gunny sack down on the plank floor near the desk and remained standing, hat in hand, eyes steady. The sack was stained dark in more than one place, and a faint sickly odor had begun to leak through the canvas, sweet and metallic. Impossible to mistake for anything except what it was. The orderly shifted his weight, gaze fixed on the damp cloth while the tracker waited without explanation. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Tappan came in from the yard still flushed from a social ride with several officers and their wives. Spurs jingled against the boards as he stepped through the doorway, brushing trail dust from his coat. He greeted Tobin with a question that carried the tension of weeks of fear in the region, words that weighed every unsolved killing, every mutilated body found along lonely tracks. Tom answered in the clipped flat way that had followed him from Taos to Bent's Fort and on through every campaign since. Then with one hand he loosened the knot on the gunny sack's neck, tipped the open mouth toward the floor and let the contents spill. Two human heads rolled forward across the worn boards, hair matted, faces slack, skin already darkening and pulling tight over the cheekbones. One still showed the crooked scar that ran along the left cheek from ear to jaw. Clouded eyes stared at nothing, their last rage burned out in a pine clearing upstream from the town of La Veta. Blood that had dried during the night flaked from beard and hair and left faint rusty trails as the heads bumped and came to rest near the polished toes of the colonel's boots. For a heartbeat, the room went silent as every man and woman present understood exactly who lay at their feet. The officers' wives, dressed in riding skirts and gloves for an afternoon excursion, did not remain composed. One woman clutched her throat, another gripped the back of a chair until her knuckles went white, and at least two screamed outright. One crumpled against her husband's chest, eyes closed, lips pulled tight as if swallowing back bile. A young lieutenant stepped forward with his hand half raised, as though he might push the grisly trophies away with the tip of a boot, then thought better of it and stopped short. The odor of old blood filled the small office now that the sack lay collapsed on its side, empty. Tappan's face shifted from disbelief to nausea, the color draining from his cheeks as he stared at the severed heads. Weeks earlier, he had read reports of crosses carved into chests, of bodies left naked in the dust north of Canyon City and south toward the New Mexico line. He had written dispatches to Denver and listened to frightened settlers tell how the Espinosa name passed from cabin to cabin. Now the proof of the killer's fate lay a few inches from his boots. He ordered an orderly to remove the remains and bury them outside the post. The man who had spent nights on patrol in fear of stumbling onto the killer's camp now struggled not to retch as he lifted the heads and carried them out, arms held stiff and straight. On the colonel's desk lay a pile of documents recovered from the Espinosa camp. Letters in careful handwriting and a diary that mixed devotional phrases with cold descriptions of killings along roads and trails. Interpreters in the garrison set to work, turning the Spanish lines into English for the officers. Page after page described shootings and mutilations, bloodletting on lonely stretches of track where travelers had believed they faced nothing worse than weather and fatigue. Counts of the dead added up to several dozen, a tally that matched the grim rumors that had poured into the fort since early spring. The papers gave names and motives wrapped in visions and religious language that made the violence even more disturbing to the literate men reading those pages by lamplight. News traveled fast in the territory. Riders came and went from Fort Garland every day, carrying mail, supply orders, and gossip. Within days, word spread through the San Luis Valley and on to Denver that the Espinosa killers had fallen. Miners in California Gulch, merchants in Canyon City, freighters along the Arkansas, and ranchers in scattered settlements heard that Tom Tobin had shot the men responsible and brought their heads in a sack. Denver papers soon carried translated fragments of the diary, printing details of the murders and the religious justifications that had driven Felipe Espinosa. For readers who had gone armed to bed for months, the name Tobin now carried the weight of deliverance. Under territorial proclamation, a large reward had been offered for the capture or killing of the responsible men. Figures mentioned in print reached into the thousands of dollars, an enormous sum in a place where many men scratched out a living with pick and shovel. Yet when Tobin reported for his pay, he received regular scout wages and rations, nothing approaching the bounty that had drawn other men into fruitless pauses earlier in the year. The colonel wrote his superiors, confirmed the death of the killers, and closed his file. In Denver, territorial officials faced empty coffers, changing administrations, and arguments over who deserved credit. The man who had taken the risk and delivered proof walked back to his ranch without the promised purse. Tom did not storm offices or harangue officials in the capital. He went home. 8 days after he dumped the heads on Tappan's floor, his wife Maria Pasquala bore a daughter in their small house near the fort. The child they named Maria Pasqualita lay swaddled while the father, who had stalked men through dark timber, now sat quietly beside the bed, boots off, sharpening his knife on a whetstone more from habit than necessity. Outside, the valley wind pushed thin clouds across the high sky. Soldiers and settlers argued in saloons over whether justice had come too late. Inside the Tobin home, the man who had ended the killings held his newborn daughter with hands that had only recently dragged Felipe Espinosa by the hair to a chopping log. In the months that followed, the Espinosa story continued to move along trails faster than freight wagons. Men in mining camps told it at night around low fires, embellishing small details, but preserving the core image of the laconic scout walking into Fort Garland with a sack of heads. Outlaws heard the same accounts. Drifters who had once dismissed militia officers and citizen posses as soft now spoke of a compact tracker from Taos who could follow boot sign through broken rock and who closed his hunts with a knife without hesitation. No newspaper recorded their private conversations, yet the presence of a man with that reputation in southern Colorado changed the tone of threats in saloons and along wagon roads. Territorial government moved more slowly. The governor who had offered the bounty did not send the money to Fort Garland. Years would pass before any sizable cash reached the Tobin household as a formal recognition of the killings. For the moment, recognition came in other forms. Military officers who had watched men fail against the Espinosas saw that a single experienced scout had achieved what companies of cavalry had not. When they needed guidance through difficult country, they sent for him. When they required a man who could read moccasin tracks in dry ground or guess the size of a party from the imprint of horse hooves, they looked to the small, bow-legged figure in black. In 1866, a new governor presented Tobin with an ornate buckskin coat decorated in fringe and beadwork. The garment came as a gesture instead of the full bounty. The scout accepted the gift without enthusiasm, more out of politeness than excitement. The coat would appear in later portraits, its elaborate trim at odds with the plain nature of the man wearing it. Somewhere between the sloping foothills and the crisp grass of the parade ground, the Army also handed him a limited edition Henry rifle, recognition for a dirty job carried out without complaint. The polished metal and oiled walnut stock stood in sharp contrast to the old Hawken, whose scarred wood had rested on the log above Felipe Espinosa's camp. Around Fort Garland, daily life resumed. The parade ground echoed with marching drills. Wagon trains continued to pass through, some bound for New Mexico, others for emerging settlements deeper in Colorado. The valley remained tense, harassed by raids from hostile bands and unsettled by disputes between longtime Hispanic families and incoming Anglo settlers. Yet one particular form of fear eased. The stories of men found mutilated along the trails south of Denver slowly turned into references in letters and memories instead of fresh newspaper lines. When people mentioned that season of killings, they also mentioned the quiet tracker who had ended it. For families who had lost sons, brothers, or husbands during that bloody year, it mattered that the killers had died under rifle and knife rather than slipping away over the mountains. Tom himself did not treat the Espinosa hunt as a crowning moment or a source of boasting. In later years, when asked, he would give a plain recounting of the trail, the camp, the shots, and the beheading. He did not soften the brutal parts, and did not polish the story into legend. The killings were work he had agreed to do once he accepted the colonel's request at Fort Garland. To him, it resembled the tracking and fighting he had already done during the Taos uprising and in other frontier clashes, even though the savagery of the Espinosa mutilations set that job apart. He still preferred to sit quietly near a fire or a doorway rather than hold court in a saloon. Even so, territorial officers and civilians continued to treat him as a man to call when the situation turned desperate. In the early 1860s, regular troops marched to fight Confederate columns and skirmish with raiding bands along rivers and overpasses. Behind those movements stood a small group of professional scouts whose knowledge of terrain and people turned orders into practical action. Tom belonged to that thin cadre. On paper, he carried the simple label of scout or guide. In practice, everyone in the San Luis Valley knew he was the man who went out after killers when they made entire communities afraid to travel roads that had once felt marginally safe. Over time, some men with warrants on their heads left the region rather than risk crossing paths with the tracker from Fort Garland. Others continued to steal stock or rob travelers, believing speed, distance, and rugged country would keep them safe. When officers or county officials weighed the cost of raising recruits or forming large posses, they considered a cheaper option that required only one seasoned scout with a lifetime of experience in following trails. The very existence of such a man adjusted calculations on both sides of the law. Criminals who might once have relied on the emptiness of the land to hide them now faced the knowledge that a determined hunter could read that land as clearly as print on a page. By the late 1860s, Tom's reputation had spread beyond Colorado. When General Penrose organized a campaign on the plains aimed at punishing raiding bands and securing travel routes, he chose Tobin as chief scout. The appointment came not from social standing, wealth, or education, but from a hard record built across nearly 3 decades on the frontier. Alongside him rode men such as his half-brother Charles Audeby and the already famous Wild Bill Hickok. Officers could select any number of younger men, but for the job of leading columns through unfamiliar coulees and river bottoms, they placed authority in the hands of the man who had slipped through tangled timber to end the Espinosas. The new assignment did not erase his role as a bounty hunter. Instead, it grew directly from it. The same habits that had carried him to the ox carcass and hiding place near La Veta now guided battalions of soldiers as they moved across grasslands where dust devils and mirages concealed danger. On the open prairie, he no longer hunted a single pair of killers. He studied faint signs that showed the passage of mounted warriors or wagon raiders, advised officers on where to camp, and interpreted the broken patterns of hoof marks near waterholes. The brutal clarity with which he had once dragged 2 heads to a fort informed every recommendation he made, because he knew that failure to read the land accurately would again cost innocent lives through raids, ambushes, or burned homesteads. In camp, enlisted men watched the 3 principal scouts share quiet conversations, each bringing a different background to the firelight. Hickok carried a legend from Kansas and Missouri. Audeby represented the old trapping and freighting days along the Santa Fe Trail. Tobin brought with him the shadow of the gunny sack on the floor at Fort Garland. Younger troopers who had heard only fragments of the Espinosa story now sat a little straighter when they learned they were riding under the direction of the man who had ended that nightmare. The respect mixed with unease when they looked at his weathered face and steady hands. As the campaign rolled eastward through low swales and out onto higher benches of the plains, Tom rode in front of the column, eyes narrowed against glare, reading every ripple in grass and dust. He pointed out old camp circles, noted where ponies had grazed during the night, and warned against taking tempting shortcuts across ground that offered no cover. When small detachments peeled away from the main body to investigate smoke or sign, they did so on routes he chose, trusting that his sense of terrain would keep them alive. The same patience that had kept him crawling through fallen timber now guided long days in the saddle under the wide sky. During this period, his path crossed that of more outlaws and dangerous men, some white, some Hispanic, some Indian. Though the records rarely capture their names the way they recorded those of famous serial killers. Small scraps in territorial histories and later recollections mention a gang near Canyon City slain by him after soldiers had chased them without success. What stands clear through the patchwork of reports is that officials repeatedly turned to Tobin when armed men threatened settlers or disrupted travel corridors. He continued to work for pay that barely rose above common wages, yet the tasks he received were those reserved for the most trusted and relentless hunters in the region. By the time the Penrose campaign wound down, Tom had spent years in roles that combined traditional scouting with the work of a professional manhunter. The Espinosa case remained the most dramatic example, but it was only one entry in a long record of dangerous assignments. Each time he accepted an order to ride out after killers or raiders, he carried into the field the memory of how swiftly brutality could spiral when authorities hesitated or failed. For ordinary people scattered along the frontier, the value of such a man could not be measured in proclamations or delayed rewards. They measured it in the simple relief of sleeping through a night without waiting for hoofbeats in the yard or gunfire at the door. Through the 1870s, the adobe walls of Fort Garland weathered wind, snow, and sun, while the San Luis Valley around them slowly filled with more people and more noise. Tracks from freight wagons cut deeper into the hard ground. Newly arrived merchants opened plank front stores near the post, selling canned goods, cloth, and hardware to soldiers and ranchers. The Denver and Rio Grande line pushed rails south and east, bringing locomotives that whistled across ground once crossed only by oxen and horses. In that changing world, Thomas Tate Tobin still rode out from his place on Trinchera Creek with the same battered Hawken, Colt pistol, and knife. A compact figure in black whose name carried a quiet edge in every camp and saloon between the Arkansas and the Rio Grande. The Espinosa hunt had already settled into memory, yet the image of the gunny sack on the colonel's floor lingered in talk wherever men discussed killings and justice. Neighbors near Trinchera Creek saw a different side of the man. They watched him mend ditches at first light, shovel in hand, boots wet with cold water. They saw him lean into a post-hole digger, set new fence rails, and lead cattle along narrow lanes toward fresh pasture. Children in the valley knew him first as the small man on the dark horse who rode past their homes at a steady walk, hat pulled low, eyes taking in everything without hurry. Only later did they hear their parents explain in low voices why no one wise raised a hand in anger under that gaze. Inside the Tobin house, days began with the scrape of chair legs on packed earth and the smell of coffee and cornmeal. Maria Pasquala moved between hearth and table with practiced efficiency, ladling out stews, twisting dough, and checking on beans that simmered in blackened pots. Their children, now growing into youth and adulthood, handled chores with the same disciplined rhythm that had carried their father through campaigns. Daughters fetched water, tended chickens, and helped in the small garden. Sons learned to handle horses, to cut hay with scythes, and to take a rifle down from pegs only when there was a clear need. Words weighed something in that house. No one wasted many. When soldiers at Fort Garland needed a scout for short trips or for special duties, they still sent for Tobin. He guided small detachments along side valleys and over sharp ridges, showed new lieutenants where snow lingered longest on the passes, and pointed out draws that favored ambush or defense. During the campaign under General Penrose, he had ridden farther out onto the plains than in his youth. But as the 1870s advanced, he spent more nights at home and fewer under Army canvas. Age thickened the muscles in his neck and back, carved deeper lines into his face, and slowed his stride slightly. Yet no one watching him mount a horse or level a rifle doubted that he could still move fast when needed. The growth of the valley did not erase violence. Fights in town still ended with men sprawled in the dust outside saloons, shirts dark with blood from knife points that slipped between ribs. Disputes over ditches and pasture boundaries still sparked confrontations that started with curses and ended with guns. Law officers in Costilla County and nearby jurisdictions came and went, some determined, some careless. A few did their best to quiet trouble with steady presence. Others took to drink, grew heavy with debt, and leaned on their badges when their own behavior backed them into corners. Stories of beatings and threats inside boarding houses and family kitchens moved through the same channels that carried news of trail robberies and livestock raids. In that environment, the name Carson meant something on both sides of the law. Christopher Kit Carson had died years earlier at Fort Lyon, leaving behind a line of children who carried his name into the next generation. One of them, William, called Billy by nearly everyone, drifted into the San Luis Valley as a young man. He worked in law enforcement in Costilla County for a time, carried a pistol with familiarity, and spoke easily with officers at Fort Garland who respected his father. Billy moved with the confidence of a man who knew that his last name opened doors and prompted handshakes in military offices and county courts. On October 4th, 1878, the Valley Church bells rang for a wedding that drew attention from soldiers and villagers alike. In the small church near Fort Garland, William Carson took Maria Pascualita Tobin as his wife. She stepped to the altar from the same adobe yard where her father had once sat cleaning his rifle after the Espinosa hunt. Family from both sides filled the pews. Hispano relatives in dark suits and shawls, Anglo friends in wool coats and simple dresses. The priest spoke in Spanish and English to ensure that every person in the room understood the vows. Outside, horses stamped and snorted in the chill air while curious neighbors waited near the doors to see the daughter of Tom Tobin join her life to that of Kit Carson's son. For a while, the marriage looked like a joining of two strong frontier lines. The couple lived near Fort Garland, close enough to the Tobin ranch that Pascualita could visit her mother regularly and that her father could ride over in less than an hour. Billy wore decent clothes, kept a roof over his young wife, and worked at jobs that required steady hands and a knowledge of local people, including time as a deputy and other responsible roles. When he visited the Tobin place, he greeted Tom with the respect due an older man who had already survived more fights than most soldiers. Meals on those days stayed tense and careful, with conversation moving from crops and water to small news from the fort and town. Alcohol undercut that fragile calm. Billy drank hard when he had coin in his pocket. The same self-assurance that made him quick with a greeting in daylight turned into a sullen edge in dim saloons once whiskey flowed. Witnesses later remembered him as a man whose tongue sharpened fast under liquor, who grew sarcastic and proud, and who liked to test others with remarks that pressed against the limits of tolerance. At home, that temper did not always stay behind clenched teeth. Neighbors heard raised voices from the Carson house more than once, heard furniture thump against walls and doors slam, heard sobs mixed with angry shouts when Billy staggered in from town with liquor on his breath. Reports of those nights did not travel along formal paths. They moved in quiet remarks between women at the well, in concerned looks exchanged between relatives at church after Mass, and in the hesitant words of children who had heard more than their parents wanted them to hear. Each account reached the Tobin home in some form. A sister, an aunt, or a cousin took Pascualita aside and asked whether she felt safe. She brushed away concern often enough, unwilling to expose her husband fully in front of people who knew both families. The bruises, when she had them, could not always be hidden. Tom did not explode in public when he first learned that Billy's temper had turned into blows. He watched and listened. Visits to his daughter's home became chances to look her in the eye, to note how she held her shoulders, to read the set of her mouth when someone mentioned her husband's name. In his younger years, he had ridden out to face men who killed strangers along roads and in lonely clearings. Now he rode shorter distances, but the instinct that had driven him to hunt the Espinosas had not faded. It turned inward toward the doorway of his daughter's house and the man who slept under that roof. The confrontation took shape in early May 1888. By then, Tobin was past 60, his hair white at the temples, his back stiff but still strong. Billy remained in his 30s, taller and broader across the shoulders, quick with a pistol and accustomed to being the youngest man in most rooms who carried real authority. Word reached Tobin that his daughter had endured another beating, harder than the earlier ones, that Billy had struck her and left marks that no shawl could conceal. The news came from someone who loved Pascualita enough to risk Tobin's anger, a relative or neighbor who had seen the fresh damage and refused to stay silent. That day, Tobin saddled his horse with the same deliberate care he had shown before leaving Fort Garland for the Espinosa hunt. He checked the cinch twice, set the hawken in its scabbard, and slid the long knife into place on his belt. The Colt hung at his hip, loaded and ready. He did not gather a posse. He did not send word to a sheriff. This was not a matter for papers and courts in his mind. This was a matter of a man beating his daughter. He mounted, turned the horse toward Fort Garland, and rode without pause, the small figure in black moving across familiar ground under a hard sky. Billy Carson's place near the fort sat inside a cluster of houses that shared yards and sheds. That afternoon he worked near a barn and a stack of tools used for handling stock and wagons. A sledgehammer used for driving stakes and lifting stubborn iron fittings leaned against a post. Newspaper accounts and later recollections agreed on the sequence that followed. Tobin dismounted, left his horse in the yard, and walked straight toward his son-in-law with the knife already in his hand. He closed the distance between them with the same direct focus he had once brought to bear when stepping into enemy camps. Words passed between the two men, short and heated. Witnesses recalled that Tobin accused Billy of beating Pascualita and announced that he intended to end that conduct himself. Billy denied nothing. He instead met the older man's anger head-on, furious that anyone would confront him in his own yard. Tobin stepped in, knife blade low and ready to thrust. He had closed fights like this many times in his life, lunging with a single decisive motion aimed at an opponent's body. Billy reached for the nearest heavy tool, the sledgehammer, gripped the handle with both hands, and swung. The hammer's iron head crashed into Tobin's skull with a dull crack that carried across the yard. The older man dropped to his knees, knife clattering from his fingers into the dirt. Blood streamed down his face and spattered his shirt. He tried to rise and reach for the fallen weapon, but the blow had scrambled his balance and blurred his vision. Billy stepped back, drew his pistol, and fired. The ball slammed into Tobin's side, low near the hip and groin, tearing flesh and muscle and driving him onto his back in the dust he had crossed a few breaths earlier. Neighbors and relatives rushed toward the noise. Some grabbed Billy's arm and wrenched the pistol away before he could fire again. Others knelt beside Tobin, pressing cloth against the bleeding wound in his side, trying to keep him conscious while they shouted for a doctor. Word spread through Fort Garland by mouth and by messenger, reaching the post and nearby homes in minutes. The first report said that Kit Carson's son had shot the famous scout dead, gunning him down in a family quarrel that had erupted into sudden bloodshed. The doctor who answered the call found Tobin still breathing, though barely. The hammer blow had crushed part of his skull, and the bullet wound bled steadily. They carried him into a house and laid him on a bed while the physician cleaned the torn flesh with water and whatever antiseptic he had at hand, probed for the ball and packed the hole as best he could with bandages. Pain clawed through Tobin's body. His breath came in sharp gasps. Strong men in the room watched and expected each gasp to be the last. Newspapers in nearby towns soon printed notices that the old scout had died from his wounds. In Denver and other points, readers scanned those brief lines and shook their heads at the irony of a man who had survived battles, sieges and manhunts, dying in a domestic fight under his own son-in-law's hand. The stories reached distant ranches and mining camps as people passed the papers from hand to hand. Men in bunkhouses and line camps mentioned his name, remembered the Espinosa hunt, and said that even the toughest hunter could not outrun time and family troubles. For a few days, the frontier treated Tom Tobin as a dead man. The frontier and the newspapers were wrong. The old tracker refused to die. Under the watch of his family, he fought through fever, blood loss, and the deep pounding in his skull that came with the swelling around the fractured bone. Days that onlookers counted in hours stretched into weeks. Each morning, someone checked for breath and a pulse and found both still present. The wound near his hip closed slowly, leaving scar tissue that pulled tight whenever he shifted in bed. His head healed less cleanly. Headaches became a constant companion. His hearing dulled on one side. Strength drained from the arm near the bullet's path. Billy Carson answered to the law for the shooting, but not in a way that satisfied everyone who had heard of the beating. Local officers arrested him and held him briefly. He claimed in formal statements that he had acted in self-defense when his father-in-law came at him with a knife. Witnesses confirmed that Tobin had initiated the attack. Courts and officials, faced with a respected surname in a case that turned on a family quarrel with few neutral observers, accepted the self-defense argument and released him. On paper, the matter ended with that decision. In kitchens and corrals, people talked longer. In the same valley, within days of the shooting, another process took place. Billy went to see Tobin. The two men spoke in private, without judge or sheriff. No newspaper recorded their exact words. Later accounts agreed that they reconciled. The older man who had tried to kill his son-in-law for beating his daughter, and the younger man who had shot him in the dirt came to terms. Pride bent, anger cooled. They shook hands and agreed to let the matter rest. The violence between them ended not with a hanging or a revenge killing, but with a truce between two men who had already poured enough blood into the same patch of ground. Recovery did not restore Tobin to his earlier condition. The hammer blow and the bullet wound left permanent marks. He walked more slowly and sometimes used a stick on uneven ground. Long rides in the saddle cost him more effort than before. At night, pain in his hip and head interfered with sleep, forcing him to rise and pace the floor of his adobe house while the rest of the valley lay under starlight. Yet he still tended his ditches, checked his fences, and kept his weapons clean. Neighbors who had once seen him stride across the parade ground at Fort Garland with easy strength now saw an older man marked by a lifetime, spent in violent places, including his own yard. Billy's path ended quickly after that truce. In January 1889, he worked with horses near Fort Garland, pistol still strapped at his side. He had adjusted the weapon's trigger to a very light pull, proud of how little pressure it needed to fire. While unhitching a team, the revolver caught and discharged. The ball tore into his leg behind the knee, ripping through flesh and lodging deep. At first, he dismissed the injury as a bad but survivable accident. Infection set in fast. The wound swelled and reddened. Stiffness spread up the limb. Lockjaw followed, clamping his jaw and stealing his breath. Within a day of the misfire, William Carson lay dead, killed by his own modified pistol rather than by any enemy hand. News of his death reached the Tobin house as quickly as the earlier report of the shooting. The widow, Maria Pascualita, grieved for a husband who had held her in good moments and hurt her in bad ones. A man who had carried a famous name and a mean streak sharpened by drink. For Tom, the passing of his son-in-law closed a brutal chapter. He had not pulled the trigger that killed Billy. He had already shed blood and spilled his own in their earlier clash. Now the Carson line in the valley continued through his daughter and grandchildren rather than through the son of Kit Carson himself. By the time the 1880s ended, people in the San Luis Valley spoke of Tom Tobin with a mixture of respect and wariness that had deepened over each decade. They remembered the headless bodies of the Espinosas on the mountain, the sack on the colonel's floor, the way outlaws and raiders adjusted their plans when they heard his name, and now the scene of him lying half dead in his own yard after confronting an abusive son-in-law. In every story, people described the same pattern in his life. When violence came into his world, whether on distant roads or under his daughter's roof, he met it head-on, with the same hard resolve that had drawn a line through the lives of killers from Taos to the Sangre de Cristo timber. On May 1st, 1900, the San Luis Valley lay under a thin spring wind that carried dust off the plowed fields and the smell of damp earth from melting drifts along the Sangre de Cristo foothills. The adobe walls of old Fort Garland still stood, but no bugle calls sounded from its yard. The army had pulled out years earlier, leaving the parade ground to weeds and the buildings to civilians who stored hay and tools where soldiers had once stacked rifles. A few miles away on Trinchera Creek, in a low house with thick walls and a sagging porch, Thomas Tate Tobin rose stiffly from his bed and dressed for another day of work at an age when many men already lay in graves. He moved slowly, one hand on the wall, until his balance settled. The hammer blow from William Carson's sledge and the bullet that had torn into his hip 20 years before still spoke every morning. Pain tracked along his skull and down his side as he straightened. He pulled on his long underwear and dark trousers, buttoned a worn black shirt, and slid his feet into boots whose leather had molded to the shape of toes broken long ago on frozen ground. His hands shook a little when he tied the laces. Age had thinned the muscle along his arms, but the tendons still stood out in hard lines when he gripped the back of a chair. In the main room, Maria Pascuala moved around the hearth with the steady care of a woman who had been keeping a house in that valley since before the fort was built. She set coffee to boil, stirred a pot of beans, and laid out tortillas on a cloth. The plaster on the walls showed hairline cracks in spots where the adobe had shifted in long seasons of frost and thaw. A crucifix hung above the table, its wood dark from years of smoke and dust. On a small shelf below it rested candles for evenings when she prayed for grandchildren scattered across the valley, and for a husband who had walked away from death too many times to expect another reprieve. Tobin sat without ceremony, accepted a cup, and wrapped both hands around it to ease stiffness from his fingers. He ate in silence, chewing slowly. Loose teeth made hard crusts and dried meat more work than they had once been. He listened while his wife mentioned neighbors who had passed by the day before, a cousin who needed help with a fence, a godchild who had asked for a story from the early years. Names like Bernal, Espinosa, Chavez, and Carson threaded through her account, tying their life to the same network of families that had filled the valley for generations. After breakfast, he stepped outside into the clear light. The air felt thin and cool. Chickens scratched near the doorway. A dog, its muzzle already white, rose from under the porch and wagged once before settling again. The ditch that carried water from Trinchera Creek to the small field needed attention. Tobin picked up a shovel and walked along its bank, testing the ground with each step. He cut away small slides, cleared clumps of weeds that choked the flow, and tamped damp earth into low spots. Each shovel load pulled at the old wound in his side, But he did not stop until the water moved cleanly along the full length. The ranch no longer turned out the number of cattle it had once carried. The children were grown. Sons and sons-in-law handled most of the hard labor now, driving stock to market on wagons or trailing them along dusty lanes toward railheads. The old man's work centered more on repair and oversight. He checked fence lines, tested gates, and walked through the small orchard to see which branches had broken under winter ice. When he spoke to the younger men, his words came short and exact. He did not waste time explaining why a post had to be reset or why a ditch bank needed extra packing. The valley had taught him that anything left half done would fail at the worst moment. Riders still came to the house, but they did not arrive under orders from colonels anymore. They came as neighbors and relatives, bringing stories and questions. Some asked him to look over a new rifle or to judge whether a certain piece of land would flood once the snowmelt swelled the creeks. Others came with smaller matters that touched the past more than the present. A man would sit at the table, remove his hat, and bring up the name Espinosa in a careful tone, wanting to hear the story of the hunt from the only living man who had been there. Tobin answered those requests in plain language. He did not dress the episodes in bravado. He described the first ambush he had seen, the track he followed into the timber near La Veta, the shots he fired, and the work he did afterward to make sure there would be no doubt in any official's mind that the killers had fallen. His voice stayed level. He did not change for effect. The listeners shifted in their chairs when he described cutting through muscle and bone. They looked at his hands and then at the knife hanging on the wall, understanding that the old man in front of them had once done things most people only heard about in whispers. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren gathered at his feet in the evenings when chores ended and the light outside faded. Among them sat a boy named after his famous grandfather on the Carson side, who would grow into a man known as Kit Carson III. Tobin watched that child closely. He saw in him the restlessness that often marked young men with known names and hard histories behind them. The old scout did not flatter him with tales of glory. When he spoke of law work, scouting, or tracking, he emphasized the long days, the risk of error, the smell of dead men on the wind, and the fact that the people who gave orders often paid slowly, if at all. In those years, cash never flowed easily into the Tobin house. He had never received the large reward the territory had once offered for the Espinosa killers. Small payments for scouting, a little money from the state, and what the ranch could produce kept them from hunger. But there were no reserves. During lean winters, Maria Pasquala stretched beans, flour, and dried meat carefully, watching the level in each sack with sharp eyes. Tobin sold a few head of cattle when necessary, standing in the dust at makeshift pens while buyers pointed at animals and argued over price. The old weapons still held pride of place in the house. The Hawken rifle stood in a corner, its stock darkened by sweat and weather, barrel clean and oiled even though he rarely fired it. The Navy Colt rested in a drawer, still loaded, each cylinder checked from time to time. On a peg near the door hung the decorated coat given by a later governor, the beadwork and fringe at odds with the plain scuffed furniture around it. When visitors asked, Tobin would lift the coat, turn it in his hands, and state only that it had come long after the main work, when most of the men he had ridden with were already gone. Outside the house, the world changed in ways that no amount of tracking skill could control. The railroad gave merchants new routes. Towns like Alamosa and La Veta grew into centers where supply houses and banks replaced mule trains and cash hidden in belts. The old trail forts, Bent's walls along the Arkansas, and the adobe square at Garland lost their military meaning. Travelers walked through the empty parade ground and imagined soldiers drilling in rows where now only chickens pecked at sparse grass. Younger men spoke of the Plains Wars as closed chapters. Yet in the San Luis Valley and across Colorado, the memory of certain hunts remained alive. Older ranchers remembered riding in fear when the Espinosa killings had reached their height, checking every patch of timber twice before leading a wagon under it. They remembered waking in the night to listen for hoofbeats, hands already reaching for rifles. Those men now sat in store doorways or leaned on hitch rails, watching children run in streets that felt safer than the roads of their own youth. When they saw Tobin pass, they lifted a hand with more than common respect. They knew that his work years earlier had helped restore the sense that a man could cross the territory without expecting to find his own chest cut open along a ditch. Old injuries and the accumulated damage of decades did not spare him. Winters cut deeper each year. In 1901 and 1902, harsh cold settled early. He coughed more, especially during stretches of damp weather, and sometimes had to stop halfway across the yard to catch his breath. The fractured skull from the hammer blow gave him spells when light hurt his eyes and when any sudden noise felt like a nail driven into his head. He bore this without complaint, sitting in the darkest corner of the room until the pain eased, then stepping outside again to check the ditch or a disturbed fence post. Doctors had little to offer beyond simple tonics and advice to rest. One physician from a nearby town examined the old bullet scar near his hip, listened to his lungs with a brass and wood tube, and shook his head at the long list of injuries. He commented that it was a wonder Tobin still walked. The patient answered with a short grunt and changed the subject. In his view, the land still needed work, and someone had to watch the ditches when spring flood came. Age and pain were conditions to be endured, not reasons to lie still while fences sagged. As the calendar turned to 1903, deaths among his generation came faster. Men who had ridden with him in St. Vrain's company, who had helped build Fort Garland, or who had guided wagon trains along the Santa Fe Trail now lay beneath simple wooden markers in scattered graveyards. Tobin attended burials when he could, standing hat in hand with his head bowed while priests or ministers said the words. Each shovelful of dirt on a coffin carried memories of shared hardships that no one else would fully understand once the last of their circle departed. He did not speak openly of his own approaching end, but those who lived with him saw the signs. He slept more during the day, dozing in a chair near the hearth with his hands folded over his stomach. At night he woke often to shift his weight or to sit up when pain made lying flat impossible. Sometimes he walked outside in the dark and looked toward the faint silhouette of Blanca Peak against the sky, listening to the creek and the distant barking of dogs from neighboring places. His mind stayed sharp. If anyone mentioned a place name from his scouting days, he could still trace the route in his head, naming each water source and dangerous stretch in order. The last spring of his life came late. Snow held on in the shade of the higher draws well into April. When the melt finally swelled Trinchera Creek, he stood at the ditch head gate longer than usual, watching the water rise and cloud with silt. He instructed a grandson on how to open the boards slowly, how to listen for the change in sound when the ditch began to carry too much and threatened to cut a new channel. The boy absorbed each instruction in the earnest way that children do when they sense that time with an elder is short. By early May 1904, Tom's strength faded in obvious ways. He spent more hours in bed, the blankets drawn up to his chest, the room around him dim to ease the throbbing in his head. Family members moved quietly, speaking in low voices. The priest from the local parish came to the house, carrying oils and the small case that held the elements for last rites. He sat at the bedside, placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, and spoke the familiar prayers in Spanish. Tobin answered as best he could, lips forming words that had accompanied him since childhood in St. Louis and through every camp and fort where Catholic families had gathered. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren filed through the room in small groups. Some knelt by the bed. Others stood back, afraid to see, the lean, fearsome figure from their stories reduced to a gaunt body under blankets. He looked at each face with clouded but still focused eyes. When he recognized them, he gave a slight nod or moved his hand a fraction in greeting. Maria Pasquala stayed beside him, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, adjusting pillows and answering when he whispered a question about the animals or the ditch. Her own hair had gone white. Deep lines marked her cheeks and mouth. She had walked beside him through every move from Taos to Trinchera Creek and through every stretch of hardship in between. On May 15, 1904, his breathing changed. It came shallow and slow, with longer pauses between each rise of his chest. Family members gathered close. Someone opened the window a little wider to let in fresh air. Outside, the creek ran with the steady sound that had been the background to their lives for decades. Inside, the only other noise came from a chair leg scraping as someone shifted weight. Tobin's eyes stayed half-closed. He did not speak. After one more thin breath, his chest did not lift again. There was no formal guard of soldiers outside the house. No volley fired over the grave by men in uniform. The army that once had relied on his scouting had long since left Fort Garland. Instead, neighbors and relatives dug the grave, cut boards for the coffin, and lined it with cloth. Men who had heard of his deeds as boys now carried the box on their shoulders. Women walked behind, rosaries in hand, murmuring prayers. The procession moved at a steady pace, boots scuffing in the dust until they reached the cemetery where so many of their own already lay. At the graveside, the priest spoke of a man who had lived many years and had used his talents in service to his community and to the safety of others. He did not list the killings or the head in the sack. He spoke instead of duty, family, and endurance. The people standing there filled in the rest in their own minds. They remembered the nights when fear of ambush had kept them awake, the mornings when news of fresh bodies along the trails had reached their homes, and the relief they had felt when word came that the killers had fallen under the eye of the silent tracker from Trinchera Creek. Clods of earth thudded on the coffin lid as men with shovels closed the grave. The sound was heavy and final. When the work ended, the mound stood fresh and raw among older, weathered markers. People lingered in small knots, speaking in low tones before turning back toward their homes. Life in the valley continued. Ditches still needed clearing, animals still needed tending, children still ran between houses and along the roads. The place that had shaped Tom Tobin did not pause. It had never paused for any man. In the years after his death, his name did not vanish. Writers collected stories of the frontier and sought out memories of men who had stood at Turley's Mill, who had marched with St. Vrain and Price, and who had watched the Espinosa terror spread. Again and again, accounts of those events included the same figure, compact, quiet, armed with a heavy rifle and a plain knife. Some recollections exaggerated, piling on details that did not match the plain records. Others kept closer to the truth, describing a man who did his work without speech-making, who hunted dangerous men as if it were another hard job like cutting timber or breaking trail. For outlaws who had worked the territory in the 1860s and 1870s, his memory remained sharper than any printed page. They had seen what happened when one determined hunter took the field against killers who believed that rough country would protect them. Even after the Espinosa season had passed, word of his presence altered routes and plans. Men who might have risked one more robbery along a certain road chose a different path after learning that the small scout from Trinchera Creek had been seen near Fort Garland. Long after his burial, stories of that kind of calculable risk continued to circulate, reminding anyone who listened that in a wide land, one hard, unswerving tracker could change the balance between hunter and hunted. Frontier life in Colorado moved into a new era that featured courtrooms, rail schedules, and printed wanted posters more than solitary scouts. Yet behind those forms stood a history in which justice or revenge sometimes rode in the saddle of a single man. Tom Tobin's life ran straight through that history. He began as a boy in a noisy river city, grew into a trapper and courier in the Taos country, survived sieges and battles, guided columns, and finally stood as the man authorities called when fear along the trails grew too heavy to ignore. His last years on Trinchera Creek showed the cost of that path in scars, pain, and poverty. His death closed one more link to a time when the difference between a free settlement and a countryside ruled by killers could rest on the work of one relentless bounty hunter riding alone into rough country with a rifle across his saddle and a clear decision in his mind.